Excuse me, very good. Welcome to the July 6th Planning Commission meeting. The first item on our agenda is the minutes from the last meeting. Have they been reviewed? Is there anything to discuss? Issues, things of that sort? And there was one what I think is an administrative error. And if you look on the final page of the minutes that Sue prepared, under accept planner's recommendation, first under accept steering committee recommendation, we had number 18 indicated. And when we discussed that, we had put that into the accept the planner's recommendation. So this is the sheet that Dan just gave you. And you can see that when we discussed it, it was... Yeah. So we discussed having the height set to 35 feet. And I don't know what happened, but I suspect what happened is when I made the motion, I put that in the wrong category. So what I think we should do is simply explicitly say that in our minutes, amend them to explicitly say that that it was our intention that number 18 be in the category of accept planner's recommendation. Does everybody comprehend that? And is that any further discussion? Does anybody need to? Very good. Okay, so that's what we did on the disc. I'm not sure what the disc says. I compared Sue's notes to my notes, and Sue's notes reflect my notes. So, and Sue looked at the notes. You believe that what you presented is consistent with the motion, correct? Yes. So my opinion at this point is that there was an administrative error in the motion. So unless if there's a better way to do it, I think the way to do it is to simply expressly state that we believe that number 18 should be accept the planner's recommendation. Okay? We need that to be included in part of the motion to approve the minutes. So that would be included in whoever makes the motion. Okay, so does anyone want to make a motion regarding the minutes?
I will make a motion that we approve the minutes as they stand, with the exception of number 18. Under accept the steering committee recommendation, we move down to under accept the planner's recommendations.
Doug, we need your microphone.
All right. I make a motion we accept the minutes as written with the exception and the correction of moving 18 from accept steering committee's recommendations down to accept the planner's recommendations.
Okay, and Doug, would you
yes,
include that is that's an addition to our minutes, regardless of what we decided in the motion? Indicate that we believe that it was there was an administrative error, because we can't go back and undo the motion, so we have to address that.
this change is required because we believe this was an administrative error, placing 18 in the wrong category.
Very good.
The other thing is to change planer to planner, put two N's in that.
All right, she'll take care of that.
Second.
Second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Nay. Motion carries. Very good. Okay, the next item on the agenda is a recommendation to the Board of Commissioners for an ordinance regarding parking structures. Dan, do you want to speak to that? Is there someone here who will speak to that for us?
I can speak to that.
Very good.
Let me just get to that section. This was, as the Planning Commission knows, we've gone back and forth over the last several years about the fact that parking structures have not been considered a building, and therefore they have not been brought to the Planning Commission's attention when we've had applications come before staff to review the construction of a parking garage. The language that is before you, staff put together the language, specifically Matt Baumann. We're looking for input from you so that we can forward this on to the commissioners if you so desire. That would basically make parking structures part of an application that you would see. So there's really just a couple of little tweaks in the language under the definition in the zoning code under section 280-4, basically stating, adding the line to the definition of building, this shall include parking structures, and then adding the line parking structures, a definition of parking structures, which states a structure that provides 2 or more levels of parking for motor vehicles. So it's really those simple 2 changes that we are asking for your comments.
Good.
Dan, can you give us a little background on what areas of the township could be considered for structured parking? I know we looked at the Radnor Financial Center before. Are there any other areas that that we've considered?
Well, Villanova has 3 structures on their property. Brandywine has one at the Radnor Financial Center. There's also one at the Radnor Corporate Center on Matson Ford Road. And what really got this prompted was the one that is being considered, went through the zoning hearing board recently, I believe it was last month, the one at Keystone Properties on Radnor Chester Road.
Okay.
So this would cover any zoning district, but this would be under the definition section.
Okay.
So I don't have in front of me which zoning districts permit, but this would cover anyone that currently would allow it.
So it would be comprehensive throughout the township.
It
So
would.
it would be Villanova, could be the center of Wayne behind the Presbyterian Church, could be Radnor Financial Center.
That is correct. This would
Okay.
make a parking structure, for lack of a better term, a building.
Okay.
Good. And part of what has been the hang-up is the definition of building referred to having enclosing walls and a roof. And we have been going under the premise that the parking structure does not have enclosing walls.
Dan, it's limited in the definition to a structure that provides 2 or more levels of parking for motor vehicles. Is there a possibility that a parking structure with just 1 level of parking would be proposed? And why is it that excluded?
Well, I think, I mean, if anyone is going to the expense to build a structure, if they're going to park on top of it, they're going to park underneath it, which would make it 2 levels. I don't think if anybody was building a structure, it would be more of a garage or a lean-to type of structure, so there would not be parking above it. It would be more protection of the cars beneath it. So I think that's why we were going with 2 or more levels.
Okay, so we're not imagining a situation where you have a structure with some other use on the ground floor and parking higher up for some reason. That would still be considered a building under the current definitions?
Yeah, well, if you're thinking of a building with parking on the roof, we would be looking at that because it was a building. So that would
It would
come
already be a
before
building.
you. That would come before you now because of the building.
Dan, is it going to be clear what is meant by 2 or more levels of parking? I'd hate to see, well, could you face a situation where the design was to have parking on 1 level, but there was a lower level, as has been suggested, and the suggestion might be made, or the design might be, that that's not intended for parking? And we would face the question whether, well, it could be used for parking. And if it didn't fall within the ordinance and it was built, and then the lower level was used for parking, are there issues that would arise? Would we be told, well, that second level's by right?
Well,
And I was also thinking of an area where the topography might be such that the 1 level might be sloped and might be integrated with other space. So I'm wondering whether that, as Julia was, whether that's,
Well, we have the Centacor building that was approved recently. That has parking underneath the building.
within the building.
It's under the footprint of the building.
So
But that is something that came before you because of the building. I guess I'm trying to think.
But you could have a situation in which you had, an open grassy area that you wanted to keep like parkland, and yet the backside's lower, you could actually have parking underneath it. It would be only one level, but it would still be below grade, and you'd still have like landscaping on top of it. I mean, would that, if it was purely parking and there was only the one structure for parking cars, would that qualify? You think,
Explain that example again.
okay. Suppose you have sort of a level, a very sloping hill, and you level out the bottom part of it and use that for parking, and you put a roof over that, and you put landscaping on top of that. That would be structure, but there'd still only be one level of parking, and the rest of it might be grass or bushes or whatever else. Would that qualify as a building under this definition?
I would say it would not, because we're saying a structure that provides 2 or more levels of parking for motor vehicles. So I would say that in your example, that would not apply, because it's not 2 or more levels for parking.
But is that something we want to have to look at?
What would the problem
I
be?
think that's for us to decide as a board.
What would the problem, Dan, be if we simply said 1 or more level of parking?
I don't see where it hurts.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say where it hurts is that then we have parking lots coming before, parking lots
Well,
with
they're not
enclosed structures. Or parking lots with, these things that you're discussing. The issue is, do we want those to come before planning? If somebody's going to put like a covered parking area, if it was 1 or more, I would interpret that to mean that it would have to come before planning, 1 or more.
Well, Dan, how are open lots, paved lots treated now? That's part of the impervious surface?
Right. That would not
Analysis.
necessarily, if someone came to build a parking lot, you would not necessarily see that. If there was a building going along with the parking lot, you would see that. But a surface parking lot would not come before you.
Well, the two terms that I think might distinguish a single-level parking facility would be level and structure, right? In a simple parking lot, there wouldn't be a structure, parking structure.
Yeah, I mean, the things that I'm hearing, I would consider that an accessory structure. Like if you're covering it to put landscaping on the top. Now, I don't know if you would interpret it that way, Dan, but.
Well, I think that's kind of unusual, but
Yeah,
I think,
right.
I don't necessarily want to see a parking lot come before you.
So I think that's the issue. To me, I mean, I gave the thought to this that I'm hearing in the discussion, that without the 2 or more, then we're going to have 1-story parking lots, parking with accessory structures around them, things of that sort, come before planning. And the issue is, as I see it, the issue is, do we want that?
Well, I would agree that we don't want those to come before us. The question is, how do we define what we do want to come before us? And if we have to provide a little more clarity by way of exclusion, perhaps we should. But I can just envision, I think as others can, that a structure having only 1 level of parking would come before us. And if the definition of a parking facility required 2 levels, then it would fall outside the definition.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, it
and
might,
not be captured.
I mean, it might come before us if somebody's trying to get around impervious coverage issues and decides to have a green roof on a parking structure as a means of dealing with it. So one of the ways possibly might be to leave the word structure in, and but maybe limit it to more than, I don't know, more than 5 or some number, where we're if somebody wants to just cover something in their backyard or put a garage port in, that's excluded. But if it's on a large commercial scale, that would be included.
How about if we had Dan, could we apply a test if it was 2 levels or in excess of 1 acre of paved surface? Something where we could have some discretion if it was a large enough area. I mean, that would require stormwater management approval anyway.
Yeah, I mean, 500 square feet would kick in our stormwater ordinance.
Right.
So
that wouldn't send it here.
That
Just
still would
because-
not send it
yeah.
here.
No, but I'm just kind of envisioning where in the,
I
you
mean,
know.
do we want to include something that says excluding surface parking lots? I mean, I don't really want to make a definition that says excluding, but is that give you a level of comfort?
See, I was going the other way. I was saying if the paved surface was in excess of a half an acre, or, 25,000 square feet, we may want to look at it because it could be it could be an area that may not necessarily lend itself to a parking lot, just. So if it's either 2 levels or it goes in excess of a certain, square footage, then it gets back to the board for review.
Well, I guess it's, what's that magic number? Where did that number come from? What's the number that kicks it in one direction or the other?
And to me, it just seems like a different issue. To me, and it's a reasonable issue, but it seems like it's a parking issue.
Right.
And this is a parking structure issue. So I'm not my opinion at this point is I'm not inclined to do that under the definition of parking structure. There might be a place for it in various aspects of the parking ordinances.
I'm thinking about, in the middle of Wayne, they proposed the buildings by the library and post office, and who knows where that is or will ever happen. But you might very well, in that instance, have parking that's subsurface and have open grassy area on top of it. That could theoretically be independent of the building itself next to it, if you broke it up right. Is that something we would want to see? Or we could say subsurface parking. I mean, that would solve my issue.
Dan, Villanova has a parking structure next to its health facility on I-10 Avenue.
That's correct.
That's not very enclosed at all, right?
That's right.
So it really has a parking deck over a parking lot.
That's correct.
Does that fall under the definition?
I would think so. That's 2 or more structures. That's 2 or more levels, excuse me. It has the parking lot, and then it has the parking above.
So that's picked up because it falls under the definition of parking structure, which by separate amendment is included in the definition of building. But it wouldn't otherwise fall into the definition of building because it has no enclosed walls.
That's right. I
Okay.
mean, that's why you did not see it when it first came in. But the fact that it says this shall include parking structures.
Is there any possibility that the argument could be made that a structure similar to that one has 1 level of parking and a parking lot, over a parking lot, and therefore does not provide 2 or more levels of parking? The structure doesn't provide 2 or more levels because one of the levels of parking is on the ground, on what was formerly a parking lot.
Well, I don't have my zoning book in front of me that gives a definition of structure, but when I hear structure, I think of something that is built to hold something up or support something. So
It would include the upper deck.
I would think that parking structure that kicks in because the upper deck is supported
Supported.
and held off the ground.
And that's the way you would interpret it.
Yes, but
Okay.
I would like to see what the definition of structure says.
So,
What do you have
Dan,
there, Judge?
a one-story parking structure, a parking structure with 1 level of parking is unheard of, right? So, correct? I mean, I can't think of,
It is heard of in the case where you have access roads and access drives on the first floor, and it's a structure, and above that is parking. That can happen. But that's the only thing I can think of where you actually have a structure and only 1 level of parking. It's when the lower level is used for drive-throughs and access.
okay. So, I'm just sort of thinking that earlier John posed the question, if that was put at 1, it really wouldn't adversely affect terribly much. It would only affect that small number of, things like what Julia just said,
Odd
because no one's going to
circumstances.
build unless it's some special circumstance, no one's going to build a structure with 1 story of parking.
Not typically, no.
Okay. All right, so shall we open it up to public comment, and then we can discuss it further? Does anyone have any further questions for Dan at this point? Okay.
I have a copy of the definition of structure, if you'd like me to read it to you.
Please.
This is on our zoning code. Definition is structure, an assembly of materials forming a construction for occupancy or use, including among others, building, stadia, tents, reviewing stands, platforms, stagings, observation towers, water tanks, trestles, piers, wharves, dams, open sheds, coal bins, fuel tanks, shelters, fences, walls, flagpoles, communications towers, and display signs. Any man-made object having an ascertainable stationary location on or in land or water.
Did you say parking decks?
I did not say parking deck.
Could you have said parking decks?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, my question is, should we amend that definition to add the words parking decks? Would that help clarify the issue?
I think it would.
Public comment? Does anyone like to speak to it?
I'd be remiss if I didn't make you aware that in our Garrett Hall ordinance, we talk about structured parking to complicate things.
Can you, excuse me, can you just announce your name?
My name is Rick Barker, and I'm speaking as the chair of the Garrett Hall Steering Committee. Thank you. So we talk about structured parking, and what our ordinance says is that structured parking needs to be wrapped with commercial space. It needs to be screened with commercial space or screened from the public view. Again, I just want to make you aware of that. I don't think there's a conflict per se, but we talk about structured parking as essentially being parking within a building.
Any other public comment? Okay, so discussion for the board. I mean, I do have one other, I think this is administrative, but I think it should include, this shall include but not be limited to parking structures, because like sort of with the concept of specification language in engineering, Dan, sometimes when specific inclusions are identified, it fuzzies other things. So does anybody have any, does that sound reasonable, that we should just sort of add that language? And I also discussed this with Mark, and I thought he was, or he indicated he was in agreement with me on that. So
That makes sense to me.
so then I think we just continue the debate that we have, see if who wants to make a motion. I mean, I'll just tell you my thoughts. I think it's okay the way it is. I could see, I don't know that it would be terribly harmful to change that to one story, because it would probably address the issue that, you know, perhaps there is a concern where someone could drive in on one level and drive around and have the parking on the top. It would be a two-story structure with one story of parking. So that seems reasonable. But let's hear what others think.
I think that would be fine. I think as long as it says a structure, we're not talking about parking lots. We're talking about built structures that are,
Right.
you know. And I don't think we need to say one or more levels. I think we just need to take it out so it says a structure that provides parking.
That works for me.
And I just, just in that minor point about this shall include but not be limited to,
Yes.
is that the language that's typically used in our ordinance when these inclusions are made? Because we don't want to start something new that's not used in other places in the ordinance.
Dan, can you comment on that?
I know it is written in occasionally that way. I don't know how often that terminology is used. I can do a fairly quick search on the computer, but obviously I can't do it right now.
I have a question. If looking at this definition, it says any man-made object having an ascertainable stationary location on or in land or water. Would a parking lot qualify? It is a man-made object, although it doesn't necessarily have a structure above grade. Or am I getting into nitpicking that's not really necessary?
Are you looking at the definition of structure?
Yeah.
Well,
Well, that's because the definition we're looking at is really the definition of building, which is any structure having enclosed walls and roof, including parking structures. So that, I think that is what separates it from a parking lot, which, you're right, would be a structure technically, but would not fit under the building definition.
but I think it would be helpful to to add the term, because of the nature of the definition of structure, which lists a number of types, to add the word parking deck or similar words to the definition of structure. Now, Don, I don't know if we can do that now, if it hasn't been, it wasn't on the agenda.
I would say we just put it in the minutes. I mean, we have to amend, this is what it is, so we make our recommendations to this, and if we think something else should be added, we include it.
Well, then I would recommend that we also amend the definition of structure to add the words parking deck or similar words. I would recommend that we say one or more rather than two or more, or, as Julia suggested, don't refer to the number of levels, but exclude explicitly an open-air parking lot. I think that's pretty clear what a parking lot is.
Yeah.
And what a structure is. But I'd hate to see something that was innovative in design, or even like the small lot in Villanova, fall outside the scope of the definition because of some reading that perhaps was tortured, but was defensible or could be made, susceptible of being made.
So can anyone think of any reason, I mean, to me that sounds reasonable what John said. Can anyone think of any reason why we wouldn't want to amend the definition of structure to include parking? Dan, can you think of anything? Can you think of any reason not to do it?
I cannot.
Okay. And then of the choice of languages, the one that I prefer is just what Julia said, to eliminate the two or more levels of parking. Now, I can't think of any reason why that would adversely affect a traditional structure. Can anyone think of it? So I think that we're just speaking to that rare but possible event that we identified. Okay, any more discussion on
Well,
it?
let me just be hyper-technical for a moment. If you remove the words two or more, you then have to determine whether the word level is singular or plural.
Well, I thought it would read a structure that provides parking for motor vehicles.
Oh, parking, okay. Sure, and if we, do we want to exclude open-air parking lots? Or is that implicit?
I wouldn't, I don't see any reason to change it except to exclude the number. A structure that provides parking for motor vehicles. I couldn't, I mean, I would not read definition of structure and think that a parking lot fits into
I would
a
not
structure.
either. I wouldn't either.
And I've never heard of that. I don't know if anyone's, so I don't think we need to
Do you
speak to
agree?
that.
Okay,
Yeah.
I withdraw that suggestion.
Okay. So is there any more discussion, or are we ready for a motion? Very well. Would someone like to make a motion?
I do have a question. We had said, shall include but not be limited to. Is that what we're talking about here?
Well, this is the way I see it. For the definition of building, we keep that, we add the language, but not limited to. In parking structure, we just drop out the number, and then we have a separate item to amend the definition of structure. That seems to be what we've discussed so far.
Okay, to amend the I'm sorry, and how will we word that, do you think? To amend the definition of structure to include a parking lot? Or a parking?
Yes.
Someone had said parking deck, but now we're introducing a new term.
To specifically include parking structures.
Thank you.
Okay, so would someone like to make a motion?
I make a motion that we recommend the ordinance revisions with the change to the definition of building to read, "This shall include but not be limited to parking structures," with the change to the parking structure definition to read, "A structure that provides parking for motor vehicles," and that we further amend the definition of structure in the zoning ordinance to include parking structures.
Is there a second?
A second.
Second.
Any discussion, debate, issues? Very well, all in favor, say aye.
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 All opposed, say nay. The ayes have it. The next item on the agenda is another ordinance change. This is for wireless communication systems. And is there someone here from the township? Sir, are you from the township?
I'm chairman of the Communications
Very good.
Cable Council.
Very good. So please introduce yourself and then tell us about the ordinance change.
My name is Tom Glynn. I'm chairman of the now Radnor Communications Council. Excuse me. An ordinance was already put through that changed the name from Cable Council to Communications Council to take into account changes in technology, specifically the needs of cell providers to broaden their coverage, and that resulted in a putting together of a subcommittee of the Communications Council with our FCC attorneys in Washington to create a new ordinance, which I understand you've been given copies of, and it is what it is. It essentially lays out the rules and regulations for cell companies to develop structures within the township, both inside and outside the right-of-way, to provide coverage for their clients, their customers.
Who developed it? Did the council develop it with staff?
Develop.
Who prepared this draft language for us?
The draft language was done by a subcommittee of the Cable Council with the staff of
input.
the township, yeah,
Very good.
and the lawyers in Washington.
Right. Is it safe to say that it's in response to changes in telecommunications?
Yeah,
So
we're
addressing,
trying to keep up with the technological changes.
so that the ordinance protects us against problems associated with contemporary technology.
Exactly.
Very good. All right, so any questions from the board?
I have a question. In the section, what is it, 28164A, it's on page 4, it cites the areas, the zoning areas that where attached wireless communication facility would be permitted as a secondary use. So obviously several of the residential areas are not included there, is that right?
I'm sorry, an antenna array is attached to an existing building, is that what you're talking about?
Where it lists the zoning categories, R5 residential, C2
Oh, I'm
commercial.
sorry, yeah. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, so of all the zoning areas in the town, of all our various zoning definitions, we're not including a lot of the residential areas, is that correct?
I don't know, it is what it is. It is what it says, I don't understand the question.
Well, for example, in
Well, how many
R3, you couldn't put in an
residential-
R3.
Or R1?
Well, I don't know what R3 and R1 are, so I can't answer your question.
Okay.
So, it's, I mean, it's,
Maybe I could ask
yeah, or,
Dan
Steve, do you have any clue?
my question, the way I'm going with this question is, I'm wondering if there are areas in the township that are residential, because this seems to cover all the other areas. If there are areas in the township that are primarily residential and don't have adequate wireless service for communications, is this ordinance going to limit the ability of the wireless companies to, find solutions where they can go into those areas of the township and provide the structures and the facilities that are needed to get that coverage?
I think that's at their discretion as to where they want to apply to put equipment to broaden their coverage.
But if we're only allowing it in these zoning districts?
I
yeah.
don't know.
I mean, my sense is that that's a very technical question that we're probably not going to get the answer to. I assumed, but we don't need to assume, so we don't have to act on this tonight.
Right.
I assumed that that was part of the preparation of the ordinance, was a sort of an understanding of coverage, and so these areas were chosen because they would provide adequate coverage. But if we're not comfortable with that, it's certainly reasonable for us to get that specific answer.
Excuse me, may I add something? I'm Steve Giancristoforo. I'm the IT director for the township.
Thanks, Steve.
I'm the liaison with the Citizens Communications Council. As part of the subcommittee who drafted this up, what we did was we laid out the township zoning districts, and we decided on these because the other districts had adequate cellular coverage. So what we were looking for here was to add the districts that we felt would be best served by these new wireless communications devices, specifically pole top units, the units that sit on top of Pico poles. So we looked at the township map, and these are the districts that we felt would be best suit the township.
Is the primary purpose of these amendments to provide better coverage for cellular use?
Better coverage and less obtrusive, both at the same time, yes.
And when you use the term districts, you're not referring to zoning categories. How do you define a district?
No, the districts, I'm meaning that as the ordinance changes states, attached wireless communications facilities shall be permitted as a secondary use within the following zoning districts: R5, C2, et cetera, et cetera.
Oh, so you're referring to zoning districts.
That's correct.
But within a zoning district, have you broken that down into areas where coverage is poor?
That would be addressed as an individual basis as the cellular companies came up to us and requested units in these zoning districts. We decided that these are the zoning districts that would be best served, that needed the coverage.
These six were identified, at least in part, because they would provide coverage for the whole township.
That is correct.
Yeah, so I think that answers Julia's question, correct? Is that your
My
question?
concern is that there are neighborhoods that don't get good cell reception right now in the township, and they're residential, I think they're R1s. And I'm just wondering,
I live in one of them.
I live in one of them too. And I'm just wondering if in the future it's determined that there's an additional facility needed in an R1 to get, as technology, improves and becomes more and more that we are relying on it, will this ordinance preclude getting that
I would
up to
say
speed?
the answer is yes.
I wouldn't.
And if we wanted to amend it to have those structures in R1, we'd have to change the ordinance. But I think, did you say your name was Steve?
Steve, yes.
Steve's point was that that was considered, at least at this point, the belief is that to provide coverage for the whole township, these 6 districts would be sufficient.
That is correct.
So I think he's saying from a technical perspective, you don't have to put it in R1 to get it to R1. You can put it in one of these other 6 and get it to R1. At least that's what I'm interpreting.
That is correct. That's exactly what we did.
Dan, do you have a zoning map handy?
I can get one, yes.
Could you bring one out?
I might also point out that under B, it authorizes special exceptions for agricultural conservation, planning, a couple of other places as well. So I'm thinking out with the houses that are being built out on Grosson, right? Isn't that right now isn't that still agricultural zoning? Aren't those still agricultural?
I don't know.
I don't know.
Serious piece. But you can get a special exception if they discover they really need it, is the point.
So, Steve, the intent of that paragraph A that we're discussing, this is on page 4, is the intent to push these structures to existing facilities? That's the way I read
That's
it.
correct.
Yes, it is.
Very good.
Yes.
Okay.
Instead of them building new, large 130, 140-foot towers, we're looking for them to attach these devices to existing structures.
The primary example being a utility pole?
Yes. We've gotten many over the last 6 months or so of large and small cellular companies requesting these new micro tower units, which They come in and they replace a Pico guy pole with a larger pole and then attach their unit to the top of it, instead of constructing a large 120 or 130-foot tower.
And is that filling in gaps or actually replacing coverage that was formerly provided by a large tower?
The micro tower is basically filling gaps, and we're getting more and more requests for them all the time. More than the larger towers.
And do you think that something like those micro towers are going to serve the R1 areas that aren't currently getting adequate service?
Those
even
in conjunction with the larger ones, too, that we're getting some applications for also. Yes,
even if they're not near those areas?
that's correct.
Steve, since this is the first time we're seeing this recommendation, is it possible to have some type of elevation or sketch that we could look at it as it relates to these smaller micro towers? I mean, we're seeing this for the first time tonight, so I'm wondering if there's any way to be able to see what they actually look like. I mean, I know the one behind this building used to be 120 feet tall, right? And that's still standing, I'm assuming. Is that the one that's directly behind us?
Alongside the building here?
Yeah, alongside the building.
Yes.
Yeah. I have that in my mind. If it's possible, the next time this comes before us, if we could get some type of rendering as to what these smaller micro towers look like?
As part of the regulations here in the proposed amendment changes, the cellular companies are required to give us an artist's rendering of what these units actually look like, yes.
Okay.
Well, do they give that not before the ordinances?
It comes first before the Citizens Communications
Right.
Council.
All right.
Yes.
If you follow technological trends, will the day come when the large towers can be replaced by multiple smaller?
I don't believe so. The larger towers are still needed for overall coverage. The small towers just fill in the gaps that the large towers, that are not feasible to be built. Where they're not feasibly be built, the smaller towers fill in the gaps.
Dan, would you have a moment to go to the zoning map and point out for us, Julia, do you want to start with a particular area, neighborhood?
Well, the key on the side shows R1 all the way down, all the residential.
Well, the problem is I can't see the map well enough to
Okay.
identify
The
any.
lighter green is R1, so it's concentrated down here. There is R1 up in the upper right-hand. This is the Woods, North Woods area. This is Parks Run.
Did you say Northwoods is R1?
Yes.
That's a notoriously bad coverage area, so it would not be covered by this ordinance amendment?
I'm not sure. I think the ordinance is designed to set out the rules and regulations for the cell companies to come in and put their facilities within the township. I don't know that it's designed to ensure, coverage of every area. I just don't know that.
No, but suppose in response to feedback from customers, residents in R1, the cellular company wanted to increase the coverage in R1
Right,
in an area that's notoriously bad for coverage.
right.
This ordinance, as proposed, would not permit that, right? Because R1 is not included.
No, I think that's a technical determination,
Yeah.
John.
I think it would.
It would exclude it if the company decided that to improve the coverage, they had to put a facility in R1.
Well,
But that's a technical determination, not
Well,
a,
I understand
okay.
that, but Steve, the Northwoods area is notoriously bad for cell phone reception.
Okay.
People walk on Northwoods Road with their cell phones because they can't get reception in their homes.
Okay.
How are you covering Northwoods Road?
The Northwoods Road would have to be covered from a tower in another district. Another zoning district.
Is there a reason not to permit the cellular company from putting one of the smaller supplemental facilities that are addressed in this ordinance in?
I don't think so. I think, the idea is to control how they do it.
But you've excluded R1, which means you've excluded that neighborhood And Julia, you may know of others.
Well, the area
I just
down-
disagree with that fundamental assumption, John.
Yeah, I
No
can't
neighborhood
imagine why
has
they would
been,
do that.
no neighborhood has been excluded. You know, there's a technical determinant, somebody, and maybe they're wrong, and we can try to get that information, but nobody's excluded any neighborhoods. They've made a determination that from these zoning districts, they can cover the
Well,
township.
that's what I thought I asked Steve, and so let me get some clarification. Can the Northwoods area in R1 be adequately covered from R5? Do you know the answer to that?
When we looked at the zoning maps, the subcommittee looked at the maps, looked at the coverage that was in place at this time, and they all agreed that it would. But if we want, we could take another look at it to see.
Well,
If you're sure that there are coverage problems there, we can certainly take a look at
well,
it.
were you aware of the coverage problems?
No.
Well, I hate to zero in on one neighborhood, but that is an area that's notoriously bad. And if you say that you were aware of that and made a determination that it could be covered from R5, that's one thing, and certainly accept that. But if you were unaware that it's notoriously bad, then the question is whether adequate consideration was given to the question of whether it could be covered from R5.
I would certainly take it back to the subcommittee. We can meet again on it and determine it.
But I think what happens is if the cell company has a problem with a coverage area, they're going to come to us to solve that problem. So I don't see why, I don't see the problem.
But the ordinance doesn't allow us to solve the problem, because if in other words, I should say, if solving the problem requires a mini tower or mini pole in an R1 or 2 or 3 district, this ordinance excludes that. So we're not able to do that.
It prohibits us from doing
It
it?
prohibits the cell company from doing it the way it is right now.
Now, I'm assuming that that's a
certainly
double-edged
wouldn't
sword to be able, I mean, I assume that R5 was put there, and Steve, tell me, because it's more desirable, I mean, I would imagine people wouldn't want these in their R1 districts.
Well, what's
Is that-
the downside? I mean, if it looks like a telephone pole,
Okay.
the smaller versions.
Steve?
Some of the pole top units are 60 to 80-foot poles, and they might not be as attractive as a pole that's 40 or 50 feet. So that's why we took into consideration the zoning districts.
So, and these zoning districts, I mean, this might be what I think is some confusion. It has nothing to do with the zoning districts. It's the geographic location of
That's
these
correct.
zones. So if that R5 could have been, it could be agriculture, and it's picked not because it's R5 and we want to do something, we want to provide coverage to R5 and not to R1. It's picked because with towers in those particular districts, we could access the entire township.
I understand that, and if I could read this map better and sit down with Steve and get a sense as to whether or not there was adequate collateral coverage from an adjoining area, I'd feel comfortable.
So that would,
But I just asked the question, were you aware there was a problem in an area? The answer was no. And is there adequate coverage for a problem you were unaware existed? And of course, there's no answer to that question. So Steve graciously agreed to take a look at it. But there might be other areas of the township that are not adequately covered. And I think it is true that as a general proposition, that the cellular providers will establish a sort of equilibrium because they're going to want to provide as much coverage as possible.
Right.
But I think that since this is a collaborative approach between the cellular companies and the township, we'd hate to have a situation where the township was aware of a bad coverage area and adopted an ordinance that would require that the cellular companies come back and seek another amendment when they discovered the problem or determined that the collateral coverage from an adjoining area was inadequate. And I don't know enough about what these new units look like, but if it's simply something on top of a utility pole in the woods somewhere, I don't know what the residents would feel about.
Now, they're usually not in the woods. They're usually on the street corners. And
But there are situations where they can construct a facility in the middle of the woods and disguise it as a pine tree
Right.
or something.
Well, is that what we're talking about here, those disguised pine trees?
That's part of it. It depends on what the cell company wants to
Well,
do.
I think the suggestion earlier that we get some elevations would be useful.
Can I ask you a question here? If you go down to, and this is under 164, this is facilities that are not in the right-of-way. Would you define for me what the right-of-way here is? Is that the public streets? and
Yeah,
things
I
like
think
that?
the right-of-way is all the public utility poles, is what we're talking about.
Public utility poles. For example, there are a lot of areas in the township, I can't think of Northwoods offhand, but they don't have above-ground power distribution, right? That's all underground, isn't that true?
I don't know.
Doug, can you tell me where you're looking on the ordinance?
Page 6. I'm talking about facilities within the right-of-way. I mean, because what this seems to say to me is that after evaluation and recommendation by the Citizens Committee, they can put it on any telephone pole in the town. Basically, is that correct? Regardless of whether, of what zoning area it is? Or am I misreading that? As long as they stay in the public right-of-way, as opposed to on somebody's backyard or something. Am I misunderstanding?
I don't know. What are you reading?
Okay, we have been talking about 280-164, okay, which are facilities outside of the right-of-way.
Okay.
Now I'm talking about 165, which are facilities within the right-of-way.
Yeah, and what's your question?
Is there any, other than, the approval by the Citizens Council, is there any prohibition on them putting up, I don't want to use the term anything, but locating poles just about any place in the public right-of-way?
I don't think so.
Does that address the concern?
What are you suggesting? They would go in and put their own poles up?
I'm just reading this and saying,
Doug, and this is what I'm hearing you say, that if there was some issue in some remote portion of the township, you would read this to say that they have the authority to go into the right-of-way and put a pole to resolve that issue, regardless, and that the debate that we were having about whether these zoning districts provide adequate physical coverage would become irrelevant because they just have to put it in the right-of-way to cover that specific area.
generally, that's what I'm
No,
saying.
I think also the other part of that point is that now that we're, as Doug has pointed out, there's two sections, 164 and 165. 164, it says facilities outside the right-of-way. I'm assuming that's the right-of-way along the streets mainly, where the poles are now, or where the underground pipes are now. And in those areas that we talked about, those zoning districts, you couldn't put a facility outside the right-of-way. But then if you look at facilities within the right-of-way, section 165, it says in all zoning districts. Such facilities shall be permitted within all zoning districts. And that's the base stations attached to utility poles, light bulbs, that sort of thing. So could someone interpret this for us and explain, does this mean that, for instance, in the R1, if there was an area that was underserviced, they could then go and locate a facility within the right-of-way, and that would be the way that they would handle that?
That's my interpretation, but
Is
I'm
that,
not a
is
lawyer.
that, is that the plan?
Dan, do you interpret it that way? That's the way I interpret it.
Because that makes more sense.
That's the way I interpret it.
Dan, what happens today if there's a cable provider or wireless provider who wants to come into the township? Is there any formal review for that particular facility, the antenna? I mean, what do we do today if there's a new application?
I'm sorry, were you talking about a cable, like a cable TV supply?
I'm talking about any tower. I think that the only one I can think of, and I believe it's still there, was on Radnor Valley Golf Course. There was an antenna that was erected.
That's a wireless.
Wireless. What is the process of getting that antenna approved through the township today?
Well, that goes through Mr. Glynn's facility, because the cable council, the communications councils looks at that first.
Yeah, they come to the Communications Council and they make a presentation and they have graphics to show where they'd like to have it located, what it's going to look like, and it has to be in conformity to both the FCC regulations and the township ordinance. That's why the ordinance was created, to control that.
Right.
So the process is that when they make their presentation, if we don't find any fault with that, we recommend it to the Board of Commissioners and/or, I guess, the Planning Commission in certain instances, Steve? There are certain,
Yeah, it usually goes from the Citizens Communications Council to the planning, or I'm sorry, Citizens Communications Council directly to the commissioners.
the commissioners.
Directly. Yes.
Okay. Okay. And is it, Steve, is it contemplated that you could have one of these towers on private property, such a residential parcel? I mean, I just haven't seen many of them in the township, so I'm not sure where they're typically located.
I think there could be, with the consent, of course, of the property owners and all of that. And I think that's provided for if you read this whole document.
Yes, that's correct.
Do you know of many or any locations where you have installed one of these stations on a pole in a place that does not have above-ground power distribution?
No, I don't know.
So that if carried to the ridiculous extreme, you could actually have a cell phone company come and put a pole up in the middle of a block or something where there were no other poles around, just for that purpose. Is that correct?
If it had a basketball hoop on it, it'd be okay. I said if there was a basketball hoop on it, it'd be okay.
Did you hear what I said?
He said he had a ridiculous
But that
proposition.
raises a question. Are we talking about things that can be put in the middle of a block to just enhance?
It's got to be along the street. It's got to be in the road right away.
In the right of way.
But theoretically, you could plop a pole with it.
Not without approval.
Well, yeah, but, okay, but
So,
it would not be prohibited by the ordinance from doing that anywhere, you know.
you know, I think if there are any amendments to the ordinance that you'd like to make, we're happy to entertain those.
Doug, why would you want to prevent the utility company from putting a pole in the street? I mean, you're saying, isn't that what they're supposed to be doing?
Yeah, I'm drawing attention to that possibility.
I don't understand the possibility that they're just, they would come in and put a pole in.
Can't be
for service.
arbitrary.
Well, the problem with it is that in some of the area's communities, all the poles, there are no poles, everything's underground. And so putting a pole up would be an eyesore compared to what they have now. Now, that might be a reasonable balance. If you need to get good cell service, the community might want that. But it's different than going into a street landscape where there are already poles and making one a little bit taller.
So then the issue is that, right, so the issue then is, should we limit the in right-of-way placement of structures? Is that right, Doug? Or should we at least consider it? We haven't considered it.
I'm just trying to draw attention to what could happen.
Well, does that speak to what you're saying, Julia, that that's the consideration, that you think we should give some consideration to limiting the placement in the right-of-way? Because we read this that if you're putting it in the right-of-way, you could put it anywhere, and that might not be desirable.
No,
Well, I don't know if that's something we'd need to put into the ordinance. I don't know enough about how the entire process works when these are proposed to say, at what point that decision would be made in terms of, balancing aesthetics with the functioning of the wireless provider facilities.
I would make this suggestion. Just suppose, and I don't know what North Woods is zoned. Is that R1 or something?
Yes.
Okay, it's R1, and you don't have any cell service there or whatever. Theoretically, the cell phone company could come and put a pole up right in the right-of-way, right next to the street or whatever, that maybe not the most attractive thing in the world. Hopefully, it looks like a flagpole. Maybe it doesn't. Would we want to say, suppose there's a piece of property behind somebody's property that's not used for much, and they wanted to put a cell tower in there, they're prohibited by this ordinance at this point. Would we want to be able to put in there a situation where we could provide for a special exception in the other residential areas? Or make that suggestion? So that in the event that we're out in North Woods and you don't want a pole on the street, but behind Joe's house is fine, we would be able to permit that somehow? Or is that not a good idea?
Well, I think that we're trying to understand the technical distribution, and that's really an engineering question. I mean, I think that issue should be addressed more fundamentally, and do we provide adequate coverage with the zones that we've identified? And, you know, we keep using R1 and R5, but the numbers don't really matter. The issue is, do those 6 zones that we selected provide adequate coverage? You're hesitant.
I'm hesitant because I think that maybe what we need is someone who can explain this better to all of us, because I think that from the way I'm reading it, what I'm getting out of this is that there are 6 zones here that are identified for facilities outside the right-of-way, whatever type of facility that might be. And the rest of the township would still be able to have facilities, but they'd have to be within the right-of-way. So so getting back to that whole point of we're going to cover the whole town from these 6, that's really not what's happening. They're not saying we can get adequate coverage by using these 6 zones as bases. They're saying that's not the point of why they picked these 6 zones. They picked these 6 zones as places where facilities could be located off the right-of-way. And there'd also be facilities eventually as needed, I would presume, in all of the other zones as needed, but they would be within the right-of-way. And that's the distinction that I'm reading here. But I'm hesitant to make to voice an opinion about whether or not this would work, because it really hasn't been explained that well.
I agree with that last sentiment.
So at a minimum, we would need more information regarding the selection of the out of right-of-way districts in which a structure is allowed, and why those 6 districts were identified.
I mean, I think we need to keep in mind that, as the Planning Commission, one of our goals is to look at this ordinance and to see the way it's written, what's the worst thing that could happen? What's the best thing that could happen? Not, of course, as we move forward and people are going to, make good decisions, and put things where they need to be and make it work, but we want to make sure that we're not setting ourselves up for a problem down the road that we just didn't give enough forethought to. And I don't see how we can do that unless we understand it better.
Well, why don't we do this? Why don't we have the chair of our subcommittee, who worked with the attorneys in Washington and the subcommittee to construct this, come to your next meeting and hopefully try and explain it so you'll understand it.
Okay, and I think what we should do is we got to continue our process, but if you're going to if someone makes a motion to table it, we should be very specific about, or as specific as we can about the information that we want to give some guidance for whoever's going to come speak to us next time. Okay, so does anybody else have anything to add before we have some public comment?
I had a couple other comments. First of all, when whomever comes back, it would be helpful if we knew with the elevations and so forth of the cell stations and what things cause cell phone service to be good or bad. Like, you don't locate these at the bottom of the hill, I would hope. Does that make sense?
No, I'm not sure what you want.
Have
you read the ordinance? The ordinance?
The ordinance, yes.
Yeah, and the size of the poles and the configuration of the, and you want, in addition to that, you want?
I was just interested in what makes coverage good or bad, and what are the characteristics in certain areas which make it lousy out in North Woods and excellent somewhere else. Okay. I have a couple other questions on other items here. One is, if you go to page 6, under 164, number 5, it says fees, costs, contractual provisions, and so forth. It goes down there, costs exceeding new construction for a support structure are presumed to be unreasonable. This is if you're trying to reach an agreement with somebody to use their, I suppose, their flagpole or whatever else on a building. I'm asking the other members of the commission, do we want to say that just because it's automatically going to be more expensive to, say, put it on Wayne Presbyterian Church, that that's automatically a justification for some putting up a tower?
Tell me what page?
Page 6.
And specifically when?
Third paragraph down, number 5.
Yeah, I
And
mean,
the
I
last sentence-
think that something has to be in there to, I'm inclined to keep it. I gave the same thought that you gave to it. But the purpose of this of E is to preference existing facilities. And there has to be some mechanism for allowing new facilities. And to me, including the cost of that facility seems reasonable. I wouldn't think that it would be wise to exclude cost as a consideration.
Well, I'm not talking about excluding costs. I'm just talking about if they're asking for $100,000 and that's $1 more than the cost of constructing new support structure, was that considered unreasonable? I'm just asking whether we should do it that way, and apparently, okay.
Maybe the best way to do this is if you could articulate the question specifically that you'd like to have the council respond to. I think that would make more sense, because I think if someone comes here, he's not an engineer, all right, he's familiar with the telecommunications law and all the things associated with that, and this was put together, you know, with the interest of the township in mind. Specific questions beforehand, would make more sense than going through this exercise again.
All right. Another question is on page 7, 166E. It says copies of ongoing FCC information concerning wireless telecommunication facilities and radio frequency emission standards, along with the projected power density of the facility and an explanation of how it'll meet FCC standards. Why do we want that information?
I'm assuming that language was put in by the attorneys at the FCC attorneys in Washington.
You know something?
I was glad to have a comment if you're ready to ask.
Sure.
Yeah, we're going to have comment. And I would say, Doug, when you have technical questions like that, we can get the answer to it. We might not get it tonight, but
That's
just
fine.
include it in any motion that's made, if
Yes,
one is
sir.
made to table it.
Thank you very much.
All right, so let's,
Just one other.
All right, go ahead, Mike.
I guess the request for whoever the expert will be for the next meeting, the elevation or specific
He's not
examples.
He's not going to be a technical expert.
No, it doesn't need to be. I just need somebody who can bring an elevation and show us what these look like. That's not, I mean, I understand
Well,
what you're
again,
saying.
I think the best way to do it is if you can articulate the question specifically relating to the ordinance that you'd like answered. We'll get the answers between now and then we don't have to go through this.
That's fine. That's fine. And I would this is just a comment to the board. I think there's certain places in the township that should be designated as off limits to these towers, and I'll articulate that in the questions as we
Very good.
formulate those.
okay. All right, so anything else before we open it up to public comment?
I just have a general question. I'm not sure who to address it to. Since we brought up the point of that there are areas in the township where there's not adequate service existing, who should residents talk to or bring that up to? Should they talk to their provider? Is there someone in the township they should talk to? Should they go to the communications group? What's the most efficient way for individual residents to try to improve the cell service in their areas?
Well, it certainly can come to the Communications Council, and we would have access to the providers and use our leverage, such as it is, to talk to them. But it's up to them to whether or not they want to provide the service. You can't compel them.
I have a comment for the board. It seems like a lot of these questions that have been raised are more technical in nature. I mean, shouldn't we be looking for a technical person to come and help explain things to us as opposed to a
So
attorney?
I think the way to proceed is for, after public comment, we'll develop the questions, and then if they're technical, then we'll say, yes, we want a technical, and I think you're right, they're going to be technical.
Okay.
So we'll have a technical person address the technical issues and a non-technical person address the non-technical issues.
That makes sense to me.
Pretty good. Anything else from the board then? All right, public comment. Come forward, please.
Yes, I'm Sarah Pilling, and I live in Garrett Hill, and I was on the committee for the Friends of the Willows Cottage. I want to draw your attention to the fact that this past spring, there was an issue of two 120-foot cell towers that was to go to zoning. One was 10 feet behind the mansion at the Willows, and the other was in Ithan Valley Park. There was such an outcry about having them in our public parks, particularly at the Willows, where the entire estate has been designated as eligible for National Historic Register. Put a cell tower right behind it just didn't seem too smart. So I'd like you to look at the situation of putting these towers in our public parks. It would be an ideal situation for the cell people, because in many cases there aren't so many houses around them, but as far as aesthetics and keeping our open space open, I think it would be very undesirable. Thank you.
One quick question. The towers you referred to, are they the towers that are described in this ordinance amendment?
The 120-foot towers? Yes. No, I just got this, so I haven't studied the whole thing, but they were 120-foot towers to look like trees. One was to be placed at Ithan Valley, and one was to be 10 feet behind the mansion at the Willows Park. But as I said, there was such an outcry that it was withdrawn, but it was to have gone to zoning.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, Jim Schneller. I live in Wayne, and I was in the same category. I think there's certain vistas in Radnor. An example, I don't know if it's relevant, would be if you're standing in many places around the old Wyeth complex. It remains free of towers, and it remains free of 60 to 80-foot poles, and I think it would be wise to have something written in there. I know there was an application for one down at Sproul and Darby Road, or Bryn Mawr Avenue, and there was some noise about it, and I think I made a comment or two, because frankly, if you look over towards the Blue Route, there's no obstruction at present, and it's pleasant scenery. Radnor only has so many scenes like that because we're so tree-laden. And second of all, fees. I can't emphasize enough to you folks to write in some fees. Everybody knows the financial situation. I know it would seem like 1,000 here, 1,000 there, but the gentlemen have just about come out and said that they're going to be plugging up bad service areas. They want this. We want this. It means there's going to be a quantity of poles that are going to be requested, and the budget at the same time is in bad straits. I think, and that's what I spoke about at that hearing, was because they were sticking with, I think, a fee of $150 for one pole, and I said it should be 10 times that much. Some of the fees in the new fee schedule are 7 to 8 times as much. And I think that the fees could also be tied to the circumstances. How does the township address if someone has demanded $20,000 for the top of their building? How can the township tie a fee to that kind of situation? Thank you.
Hi, Rick Barker, 920 Lewis Lane. I think it would be important to explain why the inclusion of R5 is appropriate in the outside of the right-of-way category and not the other residential zones. As Julia said, it may be important to include the other residential zones so they could get coverage. The R5 residents might appreciate the fact that they have access to coverage, but it could also be viewed the other way around, that the R5 residents are bearing the burden of providing coverage to the other areas. So I think it's important to educate as to the appropriateness of including this residential district and none others. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Chuck Barber. I live at 228 Hilldale Road. I've been a resident of Radnor for 30 years, and I served on the Planning Commission for 8 years, and 3 of those as chairman when we put in the 88 land use plan. And I just wanted to say, I'm actually here for another reason, but it just seems to me that there are a lot of technical questions here. There's a lot of issues that were at any kind of a tiny development, you'd have experts on traffic, you'd have experts here and there, And I think to pass an ordinance without really, particularly one of this technical nature, I didn't see the ordinance, and so, like I said, I'm here for another reason, but I would really recommend that you have all the experts that you need come in here and explain this to you. It's a revenue producer for the people that are providing these services, and certainly they provide services that all of us need. On the other hand, they're making money to do that, and I would hope that they would do, that we'd ask all the questions that we could possibly manage, and also expect them, without us having to come up with the questions, having them give a full explanation. For example, if there is a right-of-way but there are no telephone poles, what do? Do you have the right to put a telephone pole in? If you have a telephone pole that's 60 feet high, can they make it 200 feet high? I mean, I don't know. Like I said, I haven't read the paper, but it seems to me that there's an awful lot of questions in here, and it is an extremely serious matter. Thank you.
Very good. Any other public comment? Okay. So some internal discussion on the board. I've just 8 items that I think capture the things that we're missing. First is we want to look at we want to be told that the coverage is sufficient throughout the area and that the township, that this ordinance will facilitate coverage. We want to know why those 6 for the facilities outside the right-of-way, why those 6 were chosen, and specifically why only 1 residential district was identified. We want to see elevations. We want to know the effect of this on in right-of-way structure. So is it like Doug said, that someone can just put a facility in the right-of-way, in any right-of-way, any place? Doug had a specific question regarding the power density. Matt identified the concept of there probably are some areas, and one of the citizens spoke to it, there probably are some areas that we want prohibited. So we would want to investigate that and perhaps identify it, or at least make a recommendation that somebody identifies it. The point of the fees is a good point. We want to make sure that's accurate. So we even want to know how they're set. I don't know how they're set. And then in general, I think we want technical people here next time to answer specific technical questions and to be part of a sort of more of a technical discussion. So does anybody have anything to add to that? Any items that you want discussed?
I would suggest an additional approach, which is implicit in everything you said, and that is that we should keep in mind that we're dealing with competing interests here. Cell phones are a fact of life, and we need coverage in the township because they're part of everyday life. At the same time, we don't want cell towers behind National Historic sites, parks, or out our living room windows. So we have that overarching competing interests. And in the presentations the next time, we ought to, the information provided ought to be provided against that backdrop. It's a very simple concept, but that ought to be kept in mind. We can talk on one hand about increasing coverage to a particular area, but implicit in that is the understanding that we don't want new cell towers everywhere. So every question is in 2 parts. One, how are you going to provide additional coverage or accommodate additional coverage? And how are you going to do it in a way that doesn't destroy what we have in Radnor Township? I think we all start with the assumption that technological improvements permit us to reconcile those competing interests as technology develops. That's the kind of presentation we want, to explain how those issues are addressed.
I'd also just add that as long as we're getting technical, it would be helpful to understand what admission standards are for these towers and what is a normal or sort of an acceptable admission from a health perspective.
So what part of the ordinance is that you're looking at?
I'm looking at 280-166. I don't know if it's falling within the concept of paragraph B, but I'd just like to find out what is an acceptable admission.
So that's the same point that Doug identified, is that correct?
I was focusing on E.
Yeah.
Oh, and you're focusing on which one, Matt?
I think E speaks to it, but it could just be another way of saying, at what point are the emissions from these towers acceptable in other
Okay.
communities where they're built?
So even broader than that is, somebody should speak to the health impact of these, correct? Is that right?
Correct. Yeah.
Very good. Sir, did you have something more to add?
Yeah, can the Communications Council expect a list of questions that we can
Well, that's what
respond
we're going to try to do
Good.
as best we can. But I have to say that I think we want more than just a specific list and answers to the list. What we would
Well,
like.
I think that's a good starting
Yeah,
point, so
right.
we don't keep going around in circles.
Right.
And just
Okay.
to address your point, when the cell companies come in and explain what they want to do, we take into serious consideration the impact, you know, from a community standpoint, from a neighborhood standpoint, from an aesthetic standpoint.
I'm sure you do, and we're glad you do. The problem is this board isn't conversant, doesn't know what you know, so a little bit of background and explanation about those issues, but particularly, I think, from a planning point of view, we want to know how those competing interests are addressed. And we're probably curious about how that evolves over a period of time.
Not unreasonable. Okay, you done?
Okay, so anything else for the board to discuss? Any other issues?
But if you can give me some places I can go to actually do some research on, I am an electrical engineer. I'd be interested in hearing. Websites or something I can learn more about.
All right, well, we'll get them later.
Let's see what we can.
All right, so motion, would someone like to make a motion? I mean, my sense is that we want to see this tabled. We want to identify the bits
Well-
of information that people are asking for.
The question I have is whether we need a motion. Motion for what?
A motion to table it and discuss it at our next meeting.
Well, I'll make a motion that we table it for all of the reasons that we've discussed and articulated, and that's the motion.
Second?
I'll second.
Okay, now I think we should put a little more detail into it. Is anybody opposed to that?
Well,
Is that not necessary? Do you think it's not necessary?
well, we have the, I don't know, Sue, you have some minutes, some reflection of our discussion? I mean, we're not taking any action now,
Yeah,
right?
I think that's fine then.
We're
All right,
gonna
so you'll
hear
be
it
able-
again. I
You'll
think
be able
we've-
to, and it's, I mean, essentially, it's those 8 items that I identified, the one that John added, and the one that Matt added. Does anybody else have anything?
I was also going to ask, and one of the questions was going to be, what makes for good service, what makes for bad service, and why do the specific contours of the land or whatever else causes good or bad, but that's just a more generic version of. The other thing is, do we want to table it for like a month or 2 months, or are we tabling this indefinitely?
Well, I would say we would table it for 30 days until they get, I mean, there's no timeline on this, so
Okay.
whenever they get back to us with it, as soon as they can. All right, so there's been a motion and a second, and essentially John presented a concept with the idea that we could, from the minutes, the cable council could get a sense for what we want, and then and the township, and then come back to us with more information. So any discussion on it? Very well. All in favor, say aye.
All right.
Aye.
Aye. All opposed? Motion carries.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you, sir. Okay, the next item is SD 208, SD 07, which is to demolish existing restaurant and construct one new commercial building, 222 Sugar Down Road.
Don, we skipped one. There's the WBOD,
Okay.
item
Pretty
4.
good. All right, so there's an item to amend the language in the WBOD. All right, let me have this for a second. All right, so Dan, do you want to speak to that first? Or do you even need to? Do you want to just have the...
I can give you some brief background. There is someone here, Don Petroza, can speak.
Okay.
can speak
So we'll
better.
let Don Petros, so just explain your role in this and your capacity.
I apologize for raising this, but Dan, 2 minutes of background might be helpful.
Sure, that's fine, that's fine.
Is that all right, Don?
Yes, that's fine.
Yeah,
Thank
if you'll recall, and I don't have the date in front of me, but there was a plan before this board for the demolition of the Blockbuster and the Taco Bell site and the construction of a Rite Aid pharmacy on both of those parcels. That went through the board. There were a couple of issues that the board had raised. One of those was the issue of a drive-through, which is currently prohibited in the Wayne Business Overlay District. The applicant went and made several presentations, including to the implementation committee. Implementation committee, for lack of a better word, gave its blessing to come up with new language to make an exception that you see in front of you that allows drive-through in the in the Wayne Overlay District for prescription medicines and a single drive-through only. Mr. Petrosa is here representing the applicant to present this language, and he is looking for your blessing to forward this modification on to the Board of Commissioners. And that's it in a 2-minute nutshell.
Mr. Petrosa, would you like to come speak?
Good evening. My name is Don Petrosa. I'm an attorney representing Rite Aid. With me this evening are Paul Newland, who is the Director of Real Estate for the Rite Aid Corporation, and Paul Mastropieri, who is the owner of the property at 237-235 East Lancaster Avenue, which is where the Taco Bell and the Blockbuster are located. So it's from Aberdeen Avenue, moving in a westerly direction on Lancaster Avenue up to Cromer, past the Blockbuster building. What is proposed is a minor amendment to the zoning ordinance to permit a single-lane prescription drop-off, pickup, drive-through in the Wayne Business Overlay District. Rite Aid is proposing to demolish the existing Blockbuster and Taco Bell buildings at Lancaster Avenue and Aberdeen Avenues and to build a Rite Aid store with a single-lane prescription drop-off, pickup, drive-through in the rear of the building. This property is on the eastern edge of the Wayne Business Overlay District. It begins at Aberdeen, so this is the first property in the Wayne Business Overlay District. Currently, there is a blanket prohibition of drive-throughs in the WBOD. Initially, we filed an application to the Zoning Hearing Board from a variance from the prohibition of drive-throughs in the WBOD. And at the Zoning Hearing Board meeting on October 16, 2008, the board agreed that a drop-off, pickup, drive-through for prescription medicine only was a benefit to the community, and in particular to people who are sick or infirm and people with small children or elderly relatives who are sick or infirm. But the board felt that an amendment to the zoning ordinance to permit such a drive-through facility rather than a variance was the appropriate way to deal with the issue. And what Dan was referring to is before we went to the Zoning Hearing Board meeting on October 16th, we came to the Planning Commission. I believe the date was October 6, 2008, and made a presentation. The township requires one to do that when the subject of the application will also ultimately constitute a land development. And since this would certainly constitute a land development in the future if the ordinance is amended, we came and discussed this issue with the board at that time. And as you know, the procedure for enactment of a zoning ordinance amendment is spelled out in Section 609 of the Pennsylvania MPC, and the procedure includes the amendment being submitted by the governing body to the Planning Commission to provide the Planning Commission an opportunity to submit recommendations, and specifically that's in Section 609C of the MPC. It's also contained within the Township's zoning ordinance and also within the administrative code. They're all consistent. The procedure ultimately involves a public hearing before the Board of Commissioners pursuant to public notice, and ultimately, of course, the Board of Commissioners makes a decision as to whether or not to amend the ordinance. In this case, since the implementation committee was largely responsible for the creation of the ordinance, and I know after the implementation committee finished with it, it came to the planning commission and worked its way up to the board of commissioners. We went to the implementation committee to discuss this issue and to seek their support for it. We appeared before them on 2 occasions, and I was present on February 5th, 2009, when the implementation committee voted to recommend the amendment or to endorse the amendment. The proposed amendment is very simple. It adds about 20 words to the existing language of the ordinance, which is found at section 280-53.9. And it would read, it would provide that no drive-through or drive-in shall be permitted within the WBOD, and this is the new language, other than a drive-through which receives requests for prescription medicine and dispenses only prescription medicine through a single drive-through lane. And then it has the rest of the language is identical to the current language in the ordinance. So the only change in the ordinance is the addition of the words other than a drive-through which receives requests for prescription medicine and dispenses only prescription medicine through a single drive-through lane. When the implementation committee originally recommended the WBOD, the primary uses with drive-throughs that were thought about were a bank with drive-through windows and a fast food restaurant. And what we're talking about is significantly different from either of those drive-throughs. A typical fast food restaurant or bank services a substantial percentage of their customers through a drive-through. Conversely, a prescription drop-off pickup window is used far less frequently. We presented evidence before the zoning hearing board, and with your permission, I'd just like to summarize what it was on this specific issue. Counts were done at a nearby Rite Aid. It happened to be the Rite Aid in Media, Pennsylvania. And it showed, during a 9-hour period, it showed 6 prescriptions dropped off and 24 prescriptions picked up, and it was between 8 a.m. and 5 p.m., which is truly an insignificant amount of traffic through the drive-through. It's not really surprising that only 6 were dropped off, because probably what happens in the vast majority of cases is the physician's office calls in the prescription to the pharmacy, and someone, so you're going to have more pickups than you're going to have drop-offs typically. And testimony from a traffic engineer, it happened to be Christopher J. Williams from McMahon Associates, who has served as a consultant to the township on many traffic-related issues. He testified at the zoning hearing board meeting, and it cited data from the ITE, Institute for Transportation Engineers, journal that showed that the average observed service rate for a fast food restaurant was 54 vehicles per hour through the drive-through lanes, and that observed service rates for bank drive-throughs went up to 35 vehicles per drive-through lane. So the proposed prescription window that we're talking about would be expected to generate between 2 to 5 vehicles per hour. So you're comparing, 5 was the highest in any 1 hour during the counts at the Rite Aid and Media that we had. And you're comparing 2 to 5 vehicles per hour with, say, 54 vehicles per hour or 35 vehicles per hour. And the most common usage for a prescription drive-through window is by parents with sick children who do not want to park their car, take their sick child out of the car, and take them into the pharmacy when they could simply leave the physician's office, drive through the drive-through lane, and pick up their prescription medicine and go. And as I say, the way the ordinance is written, nothing else can be sold through the drive-through other than prescription medicine. Similarly, elderly or handicapped individuals find the drive-through far more accommodating, as do customers with elderly or handicapped individuals riding in the car with them, particularly at nighttime or in bad weather with icy walking conditions. Now, in this particular case, and I don't want to talk too much about this particular case because we're talking about an ordinance amendment that would affect any other property as well in the Wayne Business Overlay District. It's not just specifically for this property. But in this particular case, there is an existing drive-through at the Taco Bell. And also, we would be combining 2 parcels. Right now, there are 2 separate legal parcels with 2 folio numbers and 2 tax map numbers as well. And we would be taking 4 curb cuts along Lancaster Avenue and consolidating that into 1 curb cut along Lancaster Avenue. So minimizing curb cuts is one of the stated objectives of the WBOD. In addition, the building would be built to the build-to line, which is another major factor behind the WBOD, which is to move the buildings up to the build-to line. And at this point, we are respectfully requesting that the Planning Commission recommend to the Board of Commissioners the enactment of the proposed ordinance amendment, and we're available to answer any questions that you have. Obviously, if the ordinance is amended and this project moves forward, we would certainly be back before the Planning Commission on preliminary and final land development plans, and we would have to resolve all of those issues to the Planning Commission's satisfaction and ultimately to the Commissioner's satisfaction. But right now, we're just talking about the addition of those words that would permit a window specifically designated and allowed only for prescription medicine. And we did discuss this somewhat at the meeting back in October of 2008. So that's an overview of what the ordinance is. I think it literally adds about 20 words to the existing ordinance.
Very good. Questions from the board?
I think you may have covered this. I'm sorry. I think you may have covered this, but why wouldn't, since this is an individual site, obviously, that you're working towards having this drive-through, why wouldn't that just be handled with a variance?
I'm sorry, why wouldn't it be?
Handled with a variance?
Variance. I think what the board was saying, and I've got the transcripts and I can quote some of the comments from some of the members of the zoning hearing board. They thought it was a very desirable thing. They thought it was a benefit to the community. They thought it was a positive thing. But they didn't think that we met the legal standard for a variance, and therefore they thought that it was something that was more appropriately handled by an amendment to the ordinance. And frankly, they're probably right.
Dan, when was the business overlay district enacted? When did we approve it?
I think it was July of 2007, about 2 years ago.
2 years is right.
And since that time, how many changes have been made to the zoning, the codes?
Specific to the overlay district?
Yes.
This would be the first.
How many new developments have occurred in the Wayne Business Overlay District since that time? Since it was enacted is my question.
We had a building torn down on North Wayne Avenue and reconstructed, and the middle school got finished. We have a building being demolished now as we speak on School Lane, but that was approved before. No, that was approved after. No, that was approved before the overlay language came through. So there's been a couple of small things.
The renovation across from Anthropology, that's not affected by it. Is that correct?
That's right. That's right. That was really just the landscaping and an internal modification.
When this is not really for this, but the plan that we looked at it was in October.
Yes.
It showed that the setback from Lancaster Avenue was the build-to line, but from Aberdeen Avenue, it was quite distant. There was a big parking area on the corner. Isn't that correct?
You're right. The building remains closer to Cromer than it does to Aberdeen. That's correct. No, it was one of the issues we talked about, and we did explore quite a bit. And one of the problems is that the drive-through lane will not work. You have to have the counterclockwise circulation around the building so that the driver's side is up against the window. And we thought about it, we looked at it, and there was just no way to make that possible.
Yeah, so I think that's a significant point because, and tell me if I remember the facts correctly, but I recall that you said that this was an essential element of the plan, the drive-through.
Yes.
And that Rite Aid would probably not proceed with the development if they did not get the capability to do the drive-through prescriptions.
That is correct.
And then you also indicated with the numbers that it's a small component of the overall amount of business.
Yes.
But I think there's a discrepancy there because I do think what Doug just identified is important, that it's driving the site plan, and I think as a board, we were unhappy with the location of the building. So what we have is this small element of the plan that will affect a small number of people by your admission, but will have the most significant impact on the physical location of the building. So speak to whether I understand, I recalled the facts correctly, and then just address the issue if you'd like.
The simple fact of the matter is that the modern pharmacy, it tends to be one of the larger companies, and the mom and pop pharmacies are, probably on the way out, unfortunately, maybe depending on your perspective. But the big companies will not build a pharmacy today without a drive-through lane. Rite Aid will not do one without a drive-through lane. And although it's a relatively small number of people, it is extremely important to those people. Rite Aid has done surveys. I think Paul Newland may have indicated that here, but we've been to so many meetings, I'm not sure if it was that meeting or one of the other boards or commissions that we've been before. We even presented this to the Board of Commissioners, who authorized it to come to the Planning Commission. And it's very important to them because those customers who demand it want that particular service. So while it's small in numbers, and if you think about it from a business point of view, Rite Aid is probably better off if somebody parks the car and comes into the store to pick up the prescription medicine. More than likely, they're going to make another purchase, or there's at least a better chance they're going to make another purchase if they come into the store. So they truly are providing this as a service that their customers demand. And it is very important to somebody, whether the children are sick or not. If you've got 3 small kids in the car, you're coming back from the doctor, you've got a baby and 2 other kids, there's really no reason to have to park the car, drag them into the store.
Well, isn't it a fact, I'm surmising, but isn't it a fact that Rite Aid and the other large pharmacies see this as a growth area, that this is an idea whose time has come, and that over time, your expectation and hope is that more and more people will use this, and if you don't have it and your competitors do, you're going to be at a disadvantage. Because people get used to using a drive-through, particularly senior citizens, and not have to get out of the car. That this is an enhancement on the service that you're providing.
It's definitely an enhancement.
And it's a trend. It's a trend that's going to grow over time, it would seem to me, as a layman.
Well, as Mr. Falcone said at the zoning hearing board meeting, and he's knowledgeable in real estate matters because he's an appraiser and has done development work himself, if you don't allow a drive-through for prescriptions only in the Wayne, when I say you, I mean the township doesn't, in the Wayne Business Overlay District, you're never going to have a new pharmacy in the Wayne Business Overlay District.
But this gets to another point of mine, and that is whether current traffic statistics that take a snapshot of the number of drive-through pickups now is not necessarily accurate if this is a growing trend. What we really should be looking at and getting some idea of what it's going to be like in 5 years.
I believe we did the Rite Aid in Medium in, I think it was 1998. So it's been there a while. And these are counts based on that.
Well, I think that makes my point. If these are already traffic studies that are 10 years old.
No. It's a new traffic study based on a facility that's been existing.
That's been there since,
for that period of time.
Well, it may also.
That has 2 drive-through lanes, not one.
But let me ask a broader question, and this may be addressed to Dan as well. This proposed ordinance amendment simply removes the prohibition that's in the Wayne Overlay District against drive-throughs, right?
Just pharmacy drive-throughs.
Just for pharmacies, yes. But if a development were proposed, it would still come before us to consider not only all the other things we consider, but we would have an opportunity to consider the particular use of the drive-through as proposed in the development, including, Dan, would we, for example, consider at that time whether it was 1 or 2 lanes? Because this ordinance, I know that's been an issue with banks, and there are, again, competing theories on whether there ought to be 1 or 2 lanes. Sometimes 2 lanes are beneficial, and sometimes they cause problems. Does this simply remove the prohibition with respect to pharmacy only? And would the Planning Commission and the commissioners have a fresh look at every drive-through that was part of a development that would come before the Planning Commission, including with respect to the number of lanes, the positions of the, and the other features?
I think that all of the typical land development issues that you look at for any project that comes through, we don't even have a preliminary plan yet, would be fair game, and certainly the Planning Commission would be able to comment on those and direct us in particular ways. As far as whether we could have more than one drive-through lane, the reason for stating a single drive-through lane was at the request of the implementation committee. That was their request to which we acceded, and we thought we could live with
Does this amendment specify a single?
It does, a single drive-through lane.
I got you. I see it, yes.
But other than that, absent a zoning ordinance amendment, we couldn't have more than that. But everything else in terms, we can discuss all the other issues related to it.
Dan, do you agree?
I agree with the single. I know there's language in there that deals with banks and having stacking lanes for 12 vehicles.
No, but I'm talking about the broader proposition now, that you would not feel constrained in reviewing any business development plan involving a pharmacy drive-through with any aspect of any aspect falling within the normal parameters of zoning, simply because the prohibition against them had been removed.
If this gets approved and Rite Aid comes forward with a plan and they show a single drive-through lane, I will not bring it up in my review to this board, because I would feel that they have met and are complying with the zoning code.
But from a planning point of view, would you be inclined to bring it up if you thought it was permitted by zoning but poorly placed?
Yes, I would. And that was an issue I had at the first, when you looked at it as a sketch plan, because I do have a concern with where it's located in relation to the township's garage.
Don, I think this is a very important issue, and I think I'm hearing consistent answers. But if all we're doing is removing a prohibition, then we can address that issue. But if we are doing more, so that we are blessing particular drive-throughs or types of drive-throughs, or we would face the issue of any drive-through, and I mean pharmacy drive-throughs, having some sort of right associated with them, then I think that's a much more serious issue, and I would be much less inclined to consider it. I assumed that we would not lose the right to review the particular characteristics of a drive-through simply because we removed the prohibition. I'm really looking to Dan.
I have to say, I don't.
Does everybody agree with that?
There's no doubt that we still have every right to review any aspect of land development. The issue for us, though, is that the drive-through in and of itself has always been problematic for us.
Yeah, let's take it to a qualitative point. What we did when we created the Business Overlay District was specifically look at drive-throughs as an amenity to the community, and when we obviously approved the Bank of America building up the street. I think if you look at drive-throughs in general, particularly when you have a gateway property like the Taco Bell, because it is the first property you see when you come into the overlay district, you're setting a tone for the rest of the development going, west on Route 30. And as much as it is an amenity, and I've got 2 kids, and we pick up prescriptions, and believe me, I know there are a lot of elderly and handicapped people who live in Radnor Township who would find this to be very valuable. It sets the tone for the rest of the district. And I'll tell you, the worst development we approved in the last 5 years, in my opinion, was the Bank of America building, because it allowed for a drive-through, which then forced the building closer to Route 30, which from a planning perspective really didn't accomplish anything but provide a single lane for people to make deposits. And if you look at the condition of the building today and where it's located, as it is in context to the other properties on Lancaster Avenue, we missed the mark, in my opinion. So I think this particular property, even if you're combining the parcels and you're affording this amenity to your customers, what you're doing is you're negating every other aspect of the zoning district that we tried to conform to when we originally voted it in.
See, I disagree. I understand your comment.
Hold on a second. I want to have the debate about it after. So I want to sort of gather more facts. So are we done gathering facts? Do people have more?
I have one other little sticky point, and that is, I understand the favorable purpose of limiting it to pharmacy, but what do you do with an elderly couple whose doctor says go get a prescription and then go get an over-the-top additive? Aren't you going to be, and I'm asking you this as the pharmacy expert here, aren't there going to be an awful lot of cases where an ancillary non-prescription item as part of the same purchase is going to defeat the purpose of this drive-through?
That's a good question, and frankly, one that I had not really considered, but I think that...
And I don't mean to suggest that we open this more broadly, but it just struck me.
I think there is a difference. I mean, typically people are going to keep aspirin, ibuprofen, these types of
well,
things.
we could engage in a lengthy consideration of this.
But don't you acknowledge there's a difference between a prescription that somebody needs for a particular illness that they have at a particular time, like an antibiotic, and aspirin, for example?
Well, again, we could get into a statistical discussion here all night, but it just struck me that there may very well be, particularly as we move towards more generic over-the-counter products, that there could be an ancillary purchase at the same time. I'm thinking of elderly folks who every trip out of the house is an adventure.
It's true.
To build a day around.
One of the problems is built in. The window is really very tiny. You can't fit anything large in the window.
Well, it would be a shame if we drove a whole development for a window that didn't really have its design purpose.
Well,
So I just leave you with that thought.
Okay.
Right.
I have a question about the physical location of the drive-through. Does the technology exist to pass the prescriptions through the way banks can have a remote location? Often it's done with tubes and some kind of pneumatic system. Is that an alternative for prescriptions also? And the reason I ask is that if we're, I see the inherent value of this idea, but I'm concerned that we're letting this small use, this small, very beneficial use to a small number of people, or this beneficial use to a small number of people drive the whole site plan. So do we at least have the flexibility of remote locations like banks have?
I'll tell you my hunch and my guess, and I don't know the answer definitively. I think that the technology probably is there. I think it's probably not particularly desirable, but that's precisely the type of thing that I think this board, this planning commission reserves. And during the land development process, the board frequently will talk about access issues and other issues like that in a typical land development. And I would assume that that's another issue that you can ask us to explain to you at the land development process. Why can't we do it that way? Why can't that be done? And we'd have to provide you with specific answers, I think.
The issue, though, as I see it, is that when it's allowed, we lose the authority to so we get what the applicant wants if the applicant wants it. So even if we think it's a good idea, if the applicant doesn't think it's a good idea and we specifically allow it, then it's problematic for us.
Well, frankly, from a zoning point of view, a drive-through would be a permitted use, so the use would be permitted. But it's like a myriad of other things that planning commissions, not just this one, planning commissions all over the area deal with in planning issues, as you referred to them. And today, it's almost impossible to meet all of the requirements of the subdivision and the land development ordinance, the zoning ordinance, and all the other development ordinances that exist. And there's usually some room for a planning commission to exert a strong suggestion about an issue where an applicant might need a waiver from this provision or that provision. And I'm sure you see that typically happens.
Okay, so any other questions?
Well, that leads to one other question. I don't want to prolong this, but is it appropriate if we amend the zoning, the commissioners amend the zoning ordinance to remove a prohibition, to add some regulation in the land development ordinances to address the particular use which is no longer prohibited? Does that happen? Can that happen?
Well, I think in this specific example, they're talking about this is for prescriptions only, so.
So there isn't much regulation, but
Well, I think that in this case, it is, they're restricting themselves on what they can do.
within the zoning ordinance, right?
Right.
But it would be possible, would it not, to build in some regulations if it were deemed desirable in the land development ordinance with respect to this type of a drive-through, wouldn't it? No reason why it couldn't, would it?
I don't see why it couldn't. I mean, this to me, and I've seen these overlays over overlays, this is just spot zoning in reverse. This is the applicant coming to us and saying, this is a convenient way for us to get a plan approved, and therefore we want to provide for this zoning. I mean, that to me seems like it speaks to what this is. It's the first one that's come before us for this overlay.
May I respond
district.
to that?
Yes, sir. Yes.
I was on the implementation committee. So when I say what was talked about in terms of what kinds of uses we were thinking about, I know what I'm talking about in terms of drive-through banks and fast food restaurants. And it's apples and oranges. One of the questions that was raised before the commissioners' meeting had to do with if we amend the ordinance to allow this prescription window, can somebody come in and say, well, I'm a bank and you have to give it to me now, or I'm a fast food restaurant, you have to give it to me? And the solicitor's opinion to the Board of Commissioners was no, that there was clearly a total difference in the type of entity that you're talking about. It's apples and oranges and trying to compare them. And in fact, if this property does not get redeveloped, what you are doing is ensuring that you will have a drive-through in the Wayne Business Overlay District for a very long time, because there's a drive-through at the fast food restaurant. And if that fast food restaurant ever goes out, another fast food restaurant can come in and continue to use that drive-through. So rather than prohibiting a drive-through or discouraging a drive-through, what you would be doing is virtually assuring that there would be a drive-through there for a very long time, a much more intensively used drive-through that comes out on the Lancaster Avenue, and you can make a full left turn onto Lancaster Avenue. Excuse me?
What would your reaction be if we recommended that instead of amending the ordinance to simply permit it, we amended the ordinance to allow a special exception under certain circumstances to allow it? That would allow you to go back to the zoning hearing board, and you'd have the tool necessary to get a special exception, but not necessarily a blanket for every other piece of property in town.
Well,
So let me, and if you don't mind, just broaden that to other mechanisms, because that's going to turn on the details of what a special exception is, which
Right.
I'm not so comfortable that I can say that's a good or a bad idea. So just, if you don't mind, Doug, I'm going to have them broaden that to other mechanisms to reach your, the goal that you want, and whether there are other mechanisms available.
Well, you know, I really think that when this project comes through the land development process, you're going to get a review letter from the township engineer. We're going to get a lot of feedback from the planning commission. And it's quite possible that the plan that we wind up with is not the plan that you saw when we first came in on a sketch plan. We haven't fully engineered the plan. And I'm aware of issues, you know, with respect to the sketch plan that we did, and unless we figure out some way to resolve them, the likelihood is we're going to need some relief in the form, probably going to need a waiver or two. It's hard to find a project that doesn't need a waiver or two these days. And I think that gives the Planning Commission and the Board of Commissioners a substantial leverage.
Do you mind
addressing
special
this?
exception?
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
is
that
a reasonable thing?
A special exception it's a permitted use. It's a form of permitted use, but they can be approved only pursuant to certain defined standards. And there's a whole body of case law about what are objective standards and what are subjective standards, and who has the burden of proving them and who has the burden of going forward. I mean, there probably are zoning ordinances somewhere that do permit drive-throughs as special exception. I can't think of one off the top of my head, but so there probably are. One of the problems I've had, and this isn't your problem, and I'm not trying to put it on you, is that we've been trying to do something to facilitate this project since October of 2008, and here we are in July of 2009. And I'm just reluctant to suggest ways to put more levels of approval. We were, before the implementation committee 3 times, we've now been in the planning commission twice, we've been in the zoning hearing board and the board of commissioners, and you know, we haven't even really gotten into the plan yet. So, you know, I mean, that would be one way to do it. Would it be a way that I would particularly like? Perhaps not, but it would be a way to do it.
I mean, generally, it would add another layer of public involvement, but it wouldn't change. I mean, I'm not thinking that. I think it would not change the facts that are driving the plan. At least that's the way.
And another possibility, just to throw it out. If you, again, I don't want to get my client upset at me. I'm not suggesting that it be done, but the other possibility would be to permit it by conditional use as opposed to special exception. Because the conditional use, I don't know how the commissioners feel about that because it winds up going to them. But the conditional use itself would come back to the planning commission because the planning commission has the opportunity to review and comment on conditional uses. And that would also enable the project to, both the conditional use application and the preliminary land development plan, perhaps to proceed at the same time as opposed to in different steps.
Okay. Any other questions for Mr. Petruzzi? Okay, let's hear from the public, please. Public comment.
Well, this is why I came. As I said before, my name is Charles Barber, Chuck Barber. I've lived here for 30 years. I've been on the Planning Commission 8, served as the chairman for 3 of the 8. I don't know. I can't see Taco Bell as our gateway into the city. I mean, I just don't see Taco Bell as a good representation of what we want our community to look like.
We have a chance to change that. We have a chance now to change that.
The whole purpose of one of my understandings of the purpose of the Wayne Business Overlay District is to bring the buildings closer to the street so that they're more in conformity with the rest of the community. That's why many of the facilities that had more space in front yard parking were discouraged and they were pushed out. But that's not really why I'm here. Why I'm here is that I have, living here for 30 years, I have 3 children. All of them are in their 30s. All of them either live or work in this community. 2 of them one of them has 2 kids under 5. The 5-year-old's been taken by ambulance twice in the past year to Bryn Mawr Hospital with an EpiPen in the hip and an emergency ambulance to have treatment for allergies. And I think it's time that this committee look at the needs of the people that live here. I mean, part of what we do in a community is try to make it better for those who live in the community. And it may be you want to have a certain desire or attractiveness, but we also need to live here and we need to use this community and we need it to service us. And so part of the fact is that when you have the requirements of car seats and everything else, to take small children out and drag them out into, whether they're sick or whether they've just come out of the hospital, to drag them into a drugstore to fill a prescription, to me, when you don't need to do that, I don't understand why you would inflict that on ourselves. Number 2 is, as we go back into the elderly, there are also prescriptions that they need. They also need a lot of other things. But in due course, and when this process started, by the way, the first discussion with zoning hearing was on October 16th, which was my birthday. And when I left here, having known everybody on the zoning hearing board, every one of them I asked personally what they thought of it. They thought this was a great idea and that it should come through the process. You know, I'm rather amazed, having been active in the township, that the process takes 9 months. I mean, we're not even going to get a basic plan going here before you could gestate a child. I mean, that's a little bit much, I think. You know, maybe we need to re-examine what we're doing as a community. But anyway, the zoning hearing, we're all in favor of it. Saw no problem. We went to the implementation committee 3 times. You know, I served on the Planning Commission with Cheryl Tamulla. I can tell you Cheryl Tamulla is not an easy mark to try to get things by, and Cheryl agreed to this. I also went to the Board of Commissioners, who knew how I felt about this and said that I didn't even have to say anything to them. It was okay, and they moved it on to you. And then I find to me, the bizarre questions that I've heard in the Planning Commission. But anyway, I just wanted to let you know how I feel about it. Any questions? Yes.
I just think it would be helpful to get an application like this through the process when we're not sitting here in the middle of July, when you could come back in September and ask the parishioners at St. Catherine's or the people who take their children across the way to get their water ice at night. It happens so often that when we have these very particularly sensitive applications, when they come through.
Mr. Marshall, we started this process 9 months ago.
I was on the Planning Commission when we oversaw
That's great.
the entire overlay district. I'm not suggesting that we.
Well, and one of the questions someone asked along the way was, and Mr. McCone was there, did anyone on the Planning Commission consider that there might be a need other than a bank or a restaurant? And the answer was no. So the fact is, no one even considered that there might be somebody in this community that actually needed to get a prescription drug, which I find rather bizarre. But the fact is that that's what your job is, to represent these people, okay?
We'd like to
I
hear
tell you,
from them.
I've been here through all these processes, and there hasn't been one person from the church or one person from the water ice company that's come over and had any problems.
Okay. I think you've made your point.
Thank you.
We hear it. Thank you. Any other public comment?
I'm Jim Schneller. I, in fact, live 2 blocks from the region in question, and I'm here on kind of a theoretical basis, but it's pragmatist also. And I feel that the overlay is just in its gestation period, and there shouldn't even be any discussion about what the Taco Bell might be. I think you have to work more, while pragmatically, you have to work with the future in mind, and certainly with the future in mind is not to let amendments be made as a matter of course. I think that the intent of the overlay districts being done away with, there's no reason to. No one has shown any reason. I mean, of course, this is just a discussion, but I don't think anyone's going to be able to show a reason why amendment is necessary. And it's a pretty crucial requirement about drive-throughs. And traffic is such a narrow issue in Wayne. Do you really want that extra curb cut or that extra traffic? Do you want that extra smog from people sitting at a window? I mean, air quality is important. When you're talking about you want to increase the pedestrian traffic all the way from downtown, the people that have access down to the current Acme Shopping Center, which would be wonderful. Every time you've got a curb cut, you've got that percentage few of people who are going to enjoy that kind of town feel. And Wayne's town feel is an important factor. I don't think it's a huge selling factor because we haven't controlled the traffic, and traffic is very pushy around Wayne. And I guess I'm getting into psychology, but I've been to many towns where there's not that feeling that you're at the mercy of a car. And there's a lot I'd like to say, but it's all been said. The appearance of Wayne is so crucial. I don't think a drive-through is at all attractive, and it would be so nice. And you see the blocks changing little by little. I think the Bank of America sees such a small amount of traffic. I'm sorry a bank sees that little. I hope they're doing okay. But I know that bank up by the Anthony Wayne has always been problematic. That's not a drive-through, I hear, but that's the kind of curb cut with rear parking. Hopefully, we could even avoid. Where are people going to park? People like me let you worry about that and with the overlay district, I don't feel funny about saying that because it should be pedestrian oriented.
Other public comment?
Yes.
If I may just sum up a few
Sure.
points.
Yes.
I'll try to keep it reasonably concise. Rite Aid, as you know, is already in town next to the movie theater, and the idea would be for that store to close. And one of the problems that Paul Newland mentioned to me is that the customers are currently coming into that store asking, why don't you have drive-through service? And that's one of the reasons why they're planning to do this project. We did pay a lot of attention to building appearance, and believe me, the Blockbuster building is not a particularly attractive building, nor is the Taco Bell in my appearance. We think that we specially designed a Rite Aid. Again, this is a land development issue for this particular site. It's the first one of its kind, and it was done specifically for Radnor Township to incorporate the provisions of the Wayne Business Overlay District. As far as the neighbors and their reaction, Ruth Wisniewski from 106 North Aberdeen came to the zoning hearing board. She is the closest neighbor directly next to where the drive-thru would be and spoke in favor of it. Unsolicited, she just showed up and spoke in favor of it. In terms of doing this in July, the zoning hearing board meeting was October 16, 2008, and if you've ever seen the list of notices that have to be sent out for a zoning hearing, we blanketed the entire area, and no one showed up to oppose the application. And they all got the notice, and it was specifically to permit a drive-through for the pharmacy before the zoning hearing board. Again, this is a land development issue, but I think it's what Mr. Ewinger was talking about earlier, where we're proposing to put the drive-through, and who knows whether it'll remain there, but we're proposing to put it is in the back of the building. You won't even see it from Lancaster Avenue. It won't be visible. In terms of being concerned about the traffic impact, the testimony from the consultant to the township on traffic issues is that it will not have a negative impact, and in fact, somebody was talking about curb cuts. We'll wind up reducing 4 curb cuts down to 1 curb cut. That's tremendous traffic planning. It's absolutely wonderful traffic planning. The owner of Joe's came out, spoke in favor of it. We didn't solicit him. He was at the
So let's not talk too much about the land development application.
Okay, I agree. But as far as an ordinance being in place and being tweaked, it happens all the time in every jurisdiction. When people draft an ordinance and there are pressures to get an ordinance done, it's very, very difficult to get a perfect ordinance. It's much easier to criticize an ordinance than it is to draft one that is bulletproof and correct the first time around. And I can tell you, when this ordinance was drafted, nobody sat down and laid out a development to try to meet the requirements of the Wayne Business Overlay District. And, for example, try to see would it be feasible to get the required parking that's required under this ordinance. And it didn't get to that level. It's not until somebody actually proposes to develop a property that you get to take a hard look at these issues, and ordinances are amended all the time when it's appropriate. When it's not appropriate, they're not amended. And I respectfully submit to you that this is a part of the reason for prescription only was to pay our respect to the prohibition of drive-throughs in the Wayne Business Overlay District. We tried to make it as narrow as possible so that we could survive. And that's why we agreed to 1 drive-through and prescription medicine only. Because you're right. I mean, there might be an instance where you would like to have some other non-prescription item. But the question then becomes, well, what can you sell and what can't you sell? And is somebody going to start selling cigarettes or something like that? And that's not the intent of this. It really is to provide prescription medicine under the circumstances that we described. Thank you.
Okay, if there's no other public comment, then we'll do some internal discussion. I'll start just by describing what I think the issues are. First, I have no issue with the traffic or the curb cuts, but I think there's an issue with trade-off for the site plan itself, that it's a small element driving the site plan, and I think from the planning perspective, there are now, of course, I do believe that it's an amenity, so that's why it's a trade-off, but there are negative aspects, or negative effects on the site plan. Similarly, I think that it could likely continue indefinitely the existing drive-through, which is probably not desirable, so there's a trade-off there. Regarding other methods, I'm inclined to think that other methods like special exceptions and conditional uses will provide more public input, but with the drive-throughs, I think our experience is that the differences are often irreconcilable. It's not an issue of the public didn't know there was a drive-through. It was that the drive-through created a condition that all the information in the world wouldn't solve. So I don't think other methods, I think this is from what I see, I think this is the right method. If we decide that we want to do this, to me, this is the right method. There's an issue of a planning need versus other needs. I mean, clearly there's this desirable outcome from this change, but it also has some negative planning implications. So where are we going to make a recommendation? Are we going to say, yes, that's desirable, but it has negative planning recommendations, or do we include that desirable aspect as an element of planning? So that's some thought. Regarding John's idea of allowing it, but trying to be specific with, I'm using different words, but like trying to have performance standards, I think that would be very difficult. I think this is the sort of thing that lends itself to a prohibition or not a prohibition. I think it would be hard. Now, I think that's a good idea, and if we could identify them, but I think it would be hard to identify the specific problems because they're so site-specific. At least that's my thought. And that's based upon the handful of times that we've had drive-throughs, they've always presented site-specific problems. And then last, I have, well, second to last, there's an issue whether we want to table or vote tonight. I'm sorry it's taking so long, but if we feel that we don't have enough information to act tonight, we don't have to act. And then last, I don't have any issue with amending. I think if you want to amend it, you amend it. I don't have any issue with the intent. I don't have any issue with the timing. To me, it's just all about trade-offs, and we have to decide how we decide on those trade-offs. So does anybody else have things to add, particular items they want to discuss?
I think one of the issues we need to just touch on is that we'd be changing the zoning ordinance because of one small property. And I think that that's, something we need to consider. We talked about the practicality of this use, and the fact that while it's a drive-through, it's a very low-intensity drive-through. It's still a drive-through. And, the Wayne Business Overlay District, took a lot of thought and effort on everyone's part to put that together, and they decided not to have drive-throughs. And it's not just because of the traffic and the curb cuts. Of course, it would be great to, in this particular application, it looks like there would not be, additional curb cuts. There'd be less, which is great. But aesthetically, it would be a drive-through, whether it's in the back of the building or the front of the building. The whole building's in the Wayne Business Overlay District. It's not just the one facade. Also, the implications it has for the building placement and the architectural character of what the building would look like. We need to think about that. And the fact that one of the things that was being pushed with the overlay district was the walkability of that center section of Wayne. And this goes against that. Yes, it's practical to be able to drive right up, but it's practical to drive right up to a bank, too. I mean, a lot of older, elderly, handicapped people want drive-throughs in their banks and their restaurants. And that doesn't mean that we're going to have them everywhere, because there's that trade-off with the aesthetics and the traffic and the look of the center of the town. I think those are some of the other issues.
I think a major piece of it is if you look back at the ordinances themselves, and especially the discussion before the Wayne Business Overlay District was adopted, one of the critical pieces that we wanted mixed use all along that area, from Aberdeen Avenue down into the middle of town. The whole purpose was to get people living in the places where you had commercial buildings.
So the drive-through won't affect mixed use, though, will it?
It could affect mixed use by breaking up the continuity of it, but it's the driving out part of it. But by allowing this, you're going to encourage some kinds of. My real question is, if we do this, what other places along in the Wayne Business Overlay District are going to ask for the same thing? And not good or bad. I just
no one's going to need to ask for anything if we do this. If they have a drive-through, they'll be able to put it in, and so this has no impact on anyone else's. All it does is allow anyone who wants to put a prescription drive-through in to put it in.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
To seems to me that you're trying to create something special with the Wayne Business Overlay District, and that this drive-through kind of goes against that and changes that dynamic that you're trying to create. I'm very sympathetic to the needs of the citizens. I'd be substantially more sympathetic if this was the only place to build this, and the rest of Lancaster Avenue for miles and miles wasn't zoned commercial, and there weren't other opportunities. I'm not saying they're available today. I understand the difficulty in getting a site to accommodate that, but there are other options. It doesn't have to be here or it's nowhere.
Anything else?
Just a question. Dan, if we were to table it, how long until it comes back?
No, there's no timetable.
I would just, and this is not specific to this application, I would like to see this come back after Labor Day. These particular decisions that we make have long-term effects, and I think if everyone is confident that the public and the community is behind it, let's bring it back in September when the public and the community can have their say. That would be my only. That would be my only.
See, I'd rather act on it tonight. I think if we have, as a board, have enough information to make a decision, we should act on it and move it on. And I think there's adequate opportunity for public involvement. It doesn't all have to happen at the Planning Commission level. So I'm just inclined to think differently than you on that one.
Dan, how many pharmacies are now located in the Wayne Business District, owned by national chain? The CVS is outside, right?
The CVS is out, so there's only Rite Aid.
Well, there are two Rite Aids, aren't there?
No, there's just the one by the movie theater.
What is the one that's near the, it used to be near the Acme?
There was an Eckerd that Rite Aid took over Eckerd, but that's closed.
That's closed?
Yes.
Okay.
And that would have been outside.
Okay. Well, it's just hypothetically, if the Wayne Business District extends out to Anthropology?
To the Wawa. To
the Wawa, right.
To Bloomingdale.
Well, Don, on the question we're considering, I think removing the prohibition against pharmacy drive-throughs is a good thing. I understand the argument that with respect to a particular development, the tail can wag the dog. That is to say, the presence of the drive-through, which would be permitted, can drive the whole site development. But I hope and I think I'm right in being confident that there are sufficient standards for land development that we don't need to have the tail wag the dog. That there are, if the proposed development on the site doesn't work because it's being driven by a permitted use, it doesn't work, and we would have the right to turn down and not recommend it to the commissioners. Isn't that, as a general proposition, correct, Dan?
Yes.
All right. I think if you step back and look at the ordinances which prohibit drive-throughs, that's a good thing. There are two exceptions now, one of which is questionable historically. But now it has been proposed that there be another one that seems to have some merit. So I would be in favor of eliminating the prohibition, confident that there were sufficient controls on land development that if the use of a drive-through window created a monster, we could call it a monster and turn it down.
Very good. Anything else? Okay, so I think I'll call for a motion, and as I see it, there's sentiment to table it, and there's sentiment to vote probably in both directions. So let's call for a motion, and we'll vote. Someone like to make a motion on this amendment?
I'd move that we approve the proposed amendment to the zoning ordinance permitting, as presented to the meeting. I don't think there's been any proposal, and this is a question for everybody. There's been no proposal to tinker with the language, so I think the proposition is that we either vote for it or table it. And I would offer a motion to approve the proposed amendment.
Is there a second? Okay, hearing no second, the motion fails. May I have another motion?
I motion that we table the application until the September meeting, when there's ample public comment.
Is there a second? Having no second, the motion fails. May I have another motion?
I would move that we
need an, go ahead.
I would move that we consider amending this motion to include a what do they call it? What is conditional use?
So I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Good. That we amend the motion to allow this as a subject to conditional use.
Is there a second for that motion? Very well. Okay. Hearing no second, that motion fails. Still calling for motions. I need an affirmative motion.
I move that we recommend against the adoption of this ordinance to the Township Commissioners.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
Okay. Having a second, we'll call for a vote. All in favor of the motion, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All opposed, say nay.
Nay.
Okay. So did you get the vote, Sue? Okay. So the in favor of the motion, say aye. Raise your hand, please, so Sue can take note. And opposed to the motion, say nay. Raise your hand. Very good. The next item on the agenda is SD 2008, SD-7 final. So is the applicant here?
Yes, I'm here on this one.
Very good. Would you start us off with a brief presentation?
Let me just show you where we are. This is the what I refer to as the Johnny Cabo site. This is the back portion of the Acme Wawa. Sugartown Road is running in a generally north-south direction. Lancaster Avenue is running across the top. It's not shown on the plans. This is an internal driveway. This is the Acme. This is Kmart. And this line is representing the township and county line, Tredyffrin Township, Chester County, Radnor Township, Delaware County. This plan came before this board back in November of '08 as a preliminary plan. It was approved, moved forward to the Board of Commissioners at their November meeting, where it was approved by the Board of Commissioners again as a preliminary plan. It is now back before you as a final plan. Just to give you a little more background, currently the building ends as shown here in the aerial photograph. The proposed addition would come out mostly into Radnor Township. There's a small portion that would connect the building into the existing building that would be in Tredyffrin, and the buildings now, the majority of the buildings would be in Radnor, with the front of the buildings facing Radnor. Currently, the back of the building and the side of this building is what's visible from Radnor Township. The empty building known as Johnny Cabo's is located right in this area, and that would be demolished. So there were 15 items that the Subdivision Advisory Committee had keyed in on. Some of them are, I guess for lack of a better word, cosmetic. There were a couple that we felt needed further explanation. The first one refers to the facade of the building. The facade is 100 or 200 feet long, and the code, the zoning code, section 280-49E, requires the maximum length of the building to be 160 feet unless there is some sort of an architectural offset. Again, there are some things which they've already applied for, the NPDES with the Delaware County Conservation District. I had some more of a typographical errors that I noted in the stormwater management system. In the preliminary plan, we talked about making some upgrades to the traffic signal that's at this location. Those are repeated here. There were some things that were pointed out or were brought up while we reviewed the shade tree plans, the landscaping plans. They need an HOP or a highway occupancy permit in order to make some changes to the unsignalized intersection. Currently, this sidewalk comes out a little bit closer to the center of the intersection with all the trucks turning into the site to take care of the deliveries to the Kmart and the Acme. The sidewalk has been damaged. In the preliminary plan, we asked to have the sidewalk and this driveway widened to accommodate those trucks. They've also given me some information about the truck counts that were discussed at the preliminary plan. I'm sure the applicant has some more information that he can present to you. I had some missing the sanitary sewer information, pipe material, pipe size. Handicap ramps, I wasn't quite sure what standard they were using. They did appear to comply, but I wanted confirmation that they comply with the most current PennDOT standards. The applicant's required to go to the design review board. We have a development/escrow agreement that the applicant must sign. This is something that the new solicitor has started. And then finally, the stormwater management agreement needs to be recorded at Delaware County. That was it for the comments from the Subdivision Advisory Committee.
All right, let's hear from the applicant now, please. Just tell us.
I'm going to, for most of these, I'm going to call on Don Petrosa representing the applicant, Mike Kissinger, who's the project engineer, to respond. On the first comment about the length of the building, we had tweaked the building a little bit between preliminary and final, and that's what caused that comment to appear. On the preliminary plan, as we went through, that comment would not have been applicable. So what we propose to do is we are going to make it with some offset so that we will not exceed the 160 feet in length. And probably after some discussion with Dan Malloy, the easiest way to do that, we have to go to the design review board anyhow, and we would offer some suggested changes and see how they feel about the appropriate offset and where to put it. So that's how we would attempt to resolve that issue. Most of the other comments are all will comply, but there are a few that Mike Kissinger would like to specifically address. Mike?
Good evening. Again, my name is Mike Kissinger with Pannoni. And just speaking to a few of the comments that Mr. Malloy alluded to, number 4 about the traffic signal, we are aware of the comments, and we are the same comment as we had received in the preliminary review. The one thing that we would like to discuss further with the township engineer and the township is just how that permit or the application for that is made. The applicant is willing to take a look at the improvements, but maybe with the assistance of the township in order to expedite PennDOT, being that we are an applicant, that intersection would be, I believe, the township's ownership?
That is, permit is to the township.
So we would look to try to get some maybe assistance in expediting that through PennDOT from the township, or if it were to be handled as a township project, or however that worked, but we'd like to work that out with Mr. Malloy and the township. Number 8, basically talking about an HOP. At this point in time, we are looking to get an amendment or a maintenance permit for that back rear end exit, due to the fact that the intersection is somewhat shot based on 18-wheelers jumping the curbs. We're going to approach Delaware County in the hopes that we could get a maintenance permit, not so much an HOP, but that's something that, we would comply in the alternative with.
Could I jump in and ask a specific question about that?
Mm-hmm.
And I think the question is probably directed to Dan as well. What requirement is there that you accommodate Kmart's trucks? Why do they have an easement across the property?
That property is under common ownership, first of all, and that entrance is actually part of the Kmart lot.
So Kmart has access, you can't block it?
Correct. Well, as part of this proposal, the two lots will be consolidated into one lot. So Kmart is one and the same as this
Oh,
new
okay.
building.
And I apologize, we discussed this in November, and I apologize that we may be covering old ground that other members of the commission remember. But this will be a single parcel in 2 townships and 2 counties.
Correct.
All right, so Kmart has access through that driveway.
Correct.
Okay, then it's simply a question of which tenant, I guess, pays for the cost of widening and maintaining that driveway, is that correct?
I believe that the underlying landowner would pay for that.
Okay, all right, and you represent the landowner?
Yes, we do, with Westover.
Okay, unless you could get your tenant to pay for it.
That would be great,
All
I'm
right.
sure.
Okay, so there's no way to avoid the widening and accommodation of the 18-wheelers?
No, the widening of that is you correctly assume that it's for the 18-wheelers, not so much for the new cars coming into this site.
All right.
So we would have to do that.
Oh, okay, but then looking at it very narrowly from Radnor's perspective, and we did talk about this before. I was told before that there's no practical way to get those 18-wheelers to stay in Tredyffrin Township and not come in off Sugartown Road, number one. And number two, it was actually desirable or not undesirable to have them use Sugartown Road as opposed to Lancaster. Would you address those 2 points?
Sure.
And Dan, if you have anything to add, would you supplement?
You're correct, that all the truck traffic now comes in through the unsignalized intersection in the rear of the lot. There's a couple different things you'd like to do for safety. One is separate cars from trucks. This access point does that. It keeps the general flow of traffic away from those 18-wheelers and kind of keeps them in the back of the site. Now, as to the site constraints on the front, it's much better to have that 18-wheeler go out to Sugartown, far removed from an intersection of Lancaster Avenue, and then approach Lancaster with the ability to maneuver, rather than try to put it out onto right-in, right-out entrances along Lancaster Avenue. Along Lancaster Avenue right now, there are a couple entrances in Tredyffrin. However, the only signalized intersection is on the adjacent property owner. There is no signalized intersection along Lancaster Avenue that abuts this property.
Does, 2 things. One, you will have a conflict with cars for that office building next door, won't you? Because they use that same entrance?
No, the office building does not connect.
No, but how do you get to the office building?
Yeah, they
There's an
do connect in
easement,
the
yes.
back.
You're correct, yeah.
But the way into the office building parking is through that
It's not their
entry that
sole
we're talking.
access, but yes, there is an access way right off of the main entrance.
And do you have any concerns about 18-wheelers making right and left-hand turns at the intersection of Sugartown and Lancaster?
No, I do not.
There's sufficient space there for those
Yes.
movements to be done without causing undue interference with traffic and
There are
conflict with
significant
traffic?
areas. Yes.
Okay,
there
all right. Dan, anything to add?
No, I have nothing to add.
All right,
I
so
mean,
you're-
there will be conflicts, just as you pointed out, with the office building. I mean, there are people who enter and cut through the back, and they come in through the unsignalized intersection. Those people coming north
Right here.
on Sugartown Road, they are going to make that turn early and not have to wait at the traffic signal and try and make a left. So there will be still some conflicts with trucks. They won't be completely
People
separated.
coming south on Sugartown would turn right into that same driveway to access that office building, right?
Yes, yes, they would.
Yeah, all right,
There is a secondary access, but yes, they could.
all right. And that conflict now exists, and you're satisfied it will not get worse?
Right. Based on the truck study that we did perform under the preliminary, there were some 18 tractor trailers or delivery trucks to the back of this building. We don't see that our proposed use would add. It would probably add one truck. It would not be. It would be very small in comparison to what's there today. Just moving, I guess, through the rest of the comments. Number 12, the PennDOT ramps. The plans have been updated to address the PennDOT ramps of the latest revisions made by PennDOT. 13, we understand we will meet with the Design Review Board. And I believe that's it. Our real, we understand what we need to do with number 1. And again, as we discussed with 4 and 8, dealing with the HOP or traffic. And
I have a question about 4. Does upgrade generally mean timing, the timing of the lights?
actually, in this case, it doesn't. In the preliminary plan approval with discussions with Mr. Malloy, there is a loop system underneath the road, what you'll see is saw cuts as you approach intersections. The loop system in the intersection was looking to be improved.
Okay, so it's a physical infrastructure, piece of physical infrastructure, not the timing of the lights or the location.
Correct. We did not anticipate adjusting the timing. What we really looked at was, and Dan, correct me if I'm wrong, was enlarging the loops that are in the existing intersection, as well as providing signal heads, which the purpose of is just to update them based on today's standards.
Very good.
The PennDOT handicap accessibility standards, are they the same as like the national standards, like they call it ABAS now?
Yes and no. What PennDOT, if you've seen them, it's a rather complicated set of drawings where you actually see now reveal versus they used to have these tapers. A lot of the newest funding that's out there for townships and municipalities actually has people retrofitting intersections to meet these new PennDOT requirements. It's the truncated domes. I can show you some pictures of them if you'd like, but it does meet all American with Disabilities Act regulations as adopted by the state of Pennsylvania. That's a.
Where the trash dumpsters, where do you anticipate those to be?
In the rear of the building here, you'll see there's 2 loading docks per code, as well as a dumpster tucked into the corner.
And I thought we saw on this plan, was there some accommodation to some bike rack or something on the corner? Is it still there?
It's back where Mike is pointing.
Yeah. It's hidden under that tree on the current picture.
Dan, are you satisfied with a number of parking spaces?
Well, the number of parking spaces, as you recall, we actually have more in Radnor than what our code requires. But overall, between Radnor and Tredyffrin, it's slightly over. So site-wise, the applicant is providing a little bit more than what's required by Tredyffrin and Radnor.
And in terms of impervious surface, how do you make that calculation? On an aggregate basis?
Yes, they are. It's broken out on one of the sheets, and they are not changing the percentage. They exceed what is permitted in the zoning district, but they are not making it more than what it currently is.
And it's not unreasonable in circumstances, in your view?
That's been our practice. As long as they do not increase it, we have been allowing them to maintain the amount that is over. So they're moving it around, they're putting in rain gardens, they're putting in islands in the parking lot and breaking things up.
And the application of that consistency to this property is satisfactory in your view?
Yes.
Anything else from the board? Is there any public comment?
Yes, thank you. Hi, I'm Jim Schneller again, and thank you for your patience with me, including the applicant for the input I've been trying to lend to this. But I have to object, as I have all along, to the fact that this structure may actually be two fairly large retail establishments. And I have to challenge the parking calculations based on the fact that Tredyffrin is either looking at or has given approval, along with Chester County Planning, to everyone knows the new bank has gone up at Lancaster Pike, but apparently, tell me if I'm wrong, there is a smallish office building planned at the border of Sugartown Mews. I don't know if it's still called that. Way over here, across from Dorsini's Auto Body. So if that corner has a new pad, we're not talking about the same number of parking spaces. And the impression I tried to make when this was here before, and I think at a caucus before the Board of Commissioners, is that the place is maxing out. And anything you could do to prevent this from being, like a Wynwood or an Ardmore situation where they're really maxed out on parking, and it may have been because of prior leeway to overdevelopment. Perhaps the commission could link up with the Tredyffrin Planning Commission and make sure that the parking spaces are calculated within both townships' codes and without any leeway given at all, because we've enjoyed a fairly decent situation, and I'd hate to see it leave. I think a point I've never made is that I think this is about 1.5 to 2 times the size of the Rusty Scupper. So that's going to have equivalent traffic demands. I only see about 40 spaces here, and I'm really concerned. Also, I wanted to suggest that the timing of that light be looked at. I guess that's just another serious factor that's compromising to this proposal, is the fact that that intersection is very busy and it's very tight. There's not a lot of room. There's a lot of backup as soon as rush hour starts. When you go there in September at 3 o'clock when the kids have been out of school, it's horrendous. Are we just letting ourselves in for a mess? And finally, I don't believe they've indicated where the building entrances are, and I would just hope that they might, in the final plan, point out where these two businesses plan to have their entrances and how that will affect parking overall. It's a funny parking situation because people do not like to park for the Acme here. It's had the appearance of an empty lot, and I don't think that appearance of an empty lot is going to continue. Thank you.
If I can just interject, in the preliminary plan, the applicant had shown a building, and I'll call the bottom center of the plan, a 2,000 square foot building. That got shifted to out front along Lancaster Avenue for a period of time next to the bank that is currently being constructed in Tredyffrin. And it's my understanding that there was a discussion between the applicant and Tredyffrin where that building went away. So there is no building being proposed out front anymore.
Okay, and also if one were to be proposed, they would just have to come back and meet the parking requirements of the new building.
That's correct.
So
and that would be in Tredyffrin.
Right.
And just not to belabor things, but we had talked about trying to do something with the total number of parking spaces, and we kept coming back with, if any spaces were going to be eliminated, they would probably be the ones that are behind Kmart that don't get used. So the spaces that are here in front of the stores, we certainly hope they do get used by the people who are coming to the stores. So we had talked about trying to eliminate some of the spaces out front, but the applicant had, and he can certainly speak to it, had reservations about losing any parking spaces in front of the stores. They would rather do it behind Kmart where no one uses them.
Very good. Okay, so,
Did we already, if I remember correctly, there's stormwater running through there. That's all been addressed?
There's actually 2 storm sewer pipes. And they both converge, and I have to, I'm like,
There's an underground stream or something, isn't there?
there are 2 of them.
There's one that comes to that, and then a second one.
So there are 2 underground stormwater systems that the applicant's proposing, as well as, I believe, 5 rain gardens.
is there any other public comment? Okay, so internal discussion, does anyone on the board have anything to, about this application they'd like to discuss? And I'm ready to move on it. I've seen it, and it's consistent with the preliminary plan, so I think we should vote on it tonight. All right, does anyone, anything else to add? Okay, may I have a motion?
I move that we adopt this plan, or recommend the adoption of this plan to the Board of Commissioners.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
And Doug, would you agree to the 15 conditions that Dan identified, include those?
Yes.
And Matt, that's agreeable to you also? in your
Yes.
second? Very good. Okay, there's a motion and a second. All in favor, say aye.
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 All opposed, say nay. Very good, the motion carries.
Can I ask a question? Can we go back to a previous agenda item?
I'd rather not. Why?
I'm going to go back to the previous one.
Okay. Okay, well, the next item is old business, so Doug, if you want to go back to something, go back to it now.
Going back to the ordinance at Rite Aid, in retrospect, I would have preferred to have seconded John's motion. So I would like to make the motion that we adopt the ordinance as it is, recognizing that there are other things that will allow us to control the development as it occurs.
Can we just have that as a comment to the motion that I don't know what the procedure is for going backwards to undo a motion we've already passed. Can we just add that as a comment?
Well, I'm proposing a different motion.
Okay. So tell me again, what is your motion?
I move that we adopt the ordinance, the changes to the ordinance for the drive-through in the Wayne Business Overlay District.
Excuse me, I don't think we can do that.
Why?
Well, I think that we've already voted on a motion that's going to now go to the commissioners.
Yeah, I
as
have
our
to say,
motion.
I'm not going, we had a chance, we voted on it, and I would say that would be the inappropriate procedure. We'd have to go through a public comment period again. We'd have to start from the beginning, and I think we've already voted on it. So I'm not going to call for a second on that motion.
Well, he already seconded it, but that's beside the point.
Okay, that is beside the point. All right, so any other old items? Things for discussion? I mean, if you want to put that in if you want to have the minutes reflect your thoughts, that's fine.
That's fine.
But I don't think that's the appropriate process for calling for a motion now. All right, any items under new business? All right, is there a motion to adjourn? Second, is there a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed?